He slammed the letter down on the counter so hard the salt shaker fell over. Mara didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men who slam things are men who've already lost the argument in their heads. "You have until sundown Friday," Gideon Price said, his voice smooth as river ice. "After that, this ranch belongs to someone who actually knows what to do with it." He didn't even look at her when he said it. She was hired help. She didn't count. That was his first mistake. If you've ever been written off by someone who thought they had all the power, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end, because what happens next will remind you that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one. And if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement had been pinned to the general store board in Caldwell for 6 days before Mara Ellison finally pulled it down. She had walked past it twice. The first time, she told herself she wasn't desperate enough. The second time, she told herself the same thing, but her stomach called her a liar. Experienced cook needed. Ember Hollow Ranch. Room and board provided. Inquire with the postmaster. That was all it said. No mention of wages. No mention of how many people she'd be feeding. No mention of how far out the ranch actually sat from anything resembling civilization. Most women with options would have left it on the board. Mara had run out of options, somewhere between burying her mother in October and watching the bank lock her father's house in November. She was 29 years old. She owned one suitcase, a good cast-iron skillet, and a working knowledge of how to make something from almost nothing. In 1884 Montana, that combination was either a curse or a skill set, depending entirely on who was doing the judging. She chose to call it a skill set. The postmaster, a round man named Hewitt, who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco, had looked at her over his spectacles with the particular expression men reserve for women traveling alone. "It's a long ride," he said. 20 miles out past Granger Creek. Road gets rough after the second fork. "I've ridden rough roads before," Mara said. The rancher, Hewitt paused, seemed to be choosing his words. "He's not much of a talker. Lost his wife a few years back. Place has gone a little quiet." Mara had taken the address, thanked him, and left before he could think of another reason she shouldn't go. She arrived at Ember Hollow on a Thursday afternoon in late January, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the cold had the particular bite that gets inside your coat no matter how well you button it. The wagon driver who'd brought her out from Caldwell didn't say much, which suited her fine. She spent the ride looking at the land, the wide flat stretches of snow-covered grass, the dark line of mountains sitting against the horizon like a held breath, the occasional cluster of cattle standing with their backs to the wind. It was hard country. She had expected that. What she hadn't expected was the state of the house. The driver pulled up, set her suitcase down without ceremony, and turned his wagon around before she'd even reached the front steps. She stood there for a moment, skillet in hand, and looked at the place she had agreed to work. Porch railing had a section missing, replaced by a length of rope that someone had tied there and then apparently forgotten about. Two of the window shutters hung at angles that suggested they'd been banging loose for some time and nobody had bothered to fix them. The wood pile near the door was lower than it should have been for January. Small things, each of them. But Mara had learned that small things, accumulated, told a bigger story than any single large disaster. This was a house where someone had stopped paying attention. She knocked, no answer. She knocked again, louder. The door opened and a boy appeared, 16 maybe, thin in the way that growing boys are thin, with a smear of something on his cheek that might have been grease or might have been dried mud. He stared at her. "You the cook?" he said. "I am." "Owen, is it?" He blinked. "How'd you know my name?" "The postmaster told me there was a boy at the ranch. You look about the right age." She looked past him into the dim interior of the house. "Is Mr. Rourke here?" "He's out with the men. They'll be back before dark." Owen stepped back from the door without exactly inviting her in, which she took as close enough. She picked up her suitcase and walked inside. The smell hit her first. Not filth, exactly. Nothing that dirty. But there was a staleness to the air. The smell of a place that hadn't been properly opened or warmed or aired in a long time. A house smell when there isn't really a home inside it anymore. Kitchen was worse than the smell had prepared her for. Stove was cold. Not just unlit cold in the way that means it hadn't been properly used in days. The firebox held old gray ash and nothing else. On the table, a tin plate sat with the remains of something she couldn't identify. A pot on the stovetop had been rinsed but not cleaned. The shelf along the back wall held 4 tins, a near-empty flour sack, a half-used twist of salt, and what appeared to be approximately 3 inches of dried beans at the bottom of a jar. Mara set down her skillet. She set down her suitcase. She turned to Owen, who was watching her from the doorway with the expression of someone braced for the worst. "When did the men last have a proper hot meal?" she asked. Owen thought about it longer than she would have liked. "Yesterday morning," he said. "Mr. Rourke made oat porridge. Wasn't much, though. And tonight? What was the plan for tonight?" "There wasn't much of one," he admitted. Mara looked at the cold stove. She looked at the near-empty shelf. She looked at the window, where the afternoon light was already starting to turn toward the gray-blue. That evening was maybe 2 hours off, which meant hungry. Men would be walking through that door in considerably less time than that. She felt something settle in her chest. Not calm, exactly. More like clarity. The kind that comes when you stop waiting for the situation to improve and start deciding what you're going to do about it. "Is there a cellar?" she asked. "Out back, under the—" "Show me." Owen showed her. The cellar was better than the kitchen had led her to believe. Not much better, but enough. A crock of salt pork that was low but not empty. 3 jars of preserved green beans, 1 of beets. A small cloth sack of dried herbs thyme, she thought, and something else she'd identify by smell. 6 eggs in a wooden box, nestled in straw. She carried what she could. She sent Owen back for the salt pork. Back in the kitchen, she did the arithmetic that every cook learns to do. What do I have? What do I need? What can I make from the distance between those 2 things? It was not a comfortable arithmetic, but it was workable. Barely. The stove needed to be lit first. That was the beginning of everything. She crouched in front of the firebox, cleared the dead ash, found the kindling box empty, and looked up at Owen. He was already moving before she had to ask. She liked that about him. The boy had instincts. He came back with an armful of wood, and she built the fire herself, the way her mother had taught her, small and careful first, then feeding it until the iron began to tick and warm under her hand. There is something about a cold stove coming back to life that feels like more than just heat. Mara had felt it before, in the hard years after her father's health began failing, when keeping that stove going was the one thing she could control when everything else was slipping. The sound of it, the smell of the iron warming, the way the cold air in the kitchen begins, slowly, reluctantly, to give ground. She didn't have time to feel things right now, but she noticed. She put the beans on with the salt pork and a little of the thyme. Not enough salt, she'd have to be careful. The flour she worked with, lard. She found in a small crock tucked behind the empty tin on the shelf, combining it with a little water and salt, mixing by feel the way you mix when you've done it enough times that your hands know before your head does. She'd make drop biscuits, no time for anything more complicated. And the stove was only now starting to hold real heat. Owen sat at the table and watched her. "You worked at a ranch before?" he asked. "A few times." She kept her hands moving. "And before that, I cooked for a boarding house in Billings for 2 years. Before that, my parents' farm." She paused. "You eat enough biscuits. You get pretty good at making them." "Mrs. Rourke used to make biscuits," Owen said, and then went quiet, as if he hadn't meant to say it. Mara didn't push. She kept mixing. She was a good cook? Real good. A pause. "Everything's been different since she died." Mara looked at him, then really looked at him. This boy who had apparently been sleeping in a barn before Silas Rourke found him, who was now living in a house the stove stayed cold, and nobody thought much about supper until people were already hungry. "Hey, different how?" she asked quietly. Owen picked at the edge of the table. "Mr. Rourke, he used to eat with us. At the table, I mean with the men. Now he mostly eats by himself after, and the men he stopped. It's just different. It's quieter." Mara nodded. She'd understood kitchens well enough to know what that meant. A table where people don't gather isn't really a table anymore. It's just furniture. She rolled out the biscuit dough rough, faster than she liked, but good enough, and got them in the pan. The beans were starting to smell like something. The stove was talking now. the way a good stove does when it's working right, and the cold in the kitchen was retreating toward the corners. She heard the horses before she saw anyone. The sound of men coming in from a full day of cold work is its own kind of sound, boots heavy, voices lower than they'd be if they had the energy for anything else, the specific silence of exhaustion. She heard them stop in the yard. She heard one say something she couldn't make out. Then the door opened and they came in, 4 of them, with a 5th just behind, and they all stopped when they walked into the kitchen. Not because of her, exactly, though that was part of it. They stopped because of the smell. There is no force on earth quite like the smell of food cooking when you're cold and tired and haven't eaten properly in longer than you want to admit. It does something to a person that goes beyond hunger. It reaches past the stomach into something older and quieter. The men stood there and breathed it in. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard named Pete, she'd learned later actually closed his eyes for a second. Then Silas Rourke walked in last. He was taller than she'd expected. Lean in the way of men who work hard and forget to eat, which was its own kind of telling. His face was weathered in the way that 40-year-old ranchers' faces are weathered. But there was something underneath it, not age exactly, but something heavier than age. He looked at the stove. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. He didn't say anything, Mr. Rourke, she said, because someone had to. I'm Mara Ellison. I came about the cook position. He looked at her for another moment. You're already cooking, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't an approval either. The men looked like they needed supper, she said simply. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise. Something more complicated than that. We haven't talked wages, he said. We can talk after supper, Mara said, and turned back to check the biscuits. There was a silence in the kitchen, not uncomfortable, just suspended, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Then Pete pulled out a chair and sat down. The others followed, one by one, with the slightly sheepish air of men who have been cold and tired for too long to maintain any pretense about priorities. Silas sat last, at the head of the table, but only barely, as if he wasn't entirely sure. That was still CC. Mara served the beans first, then the biscuits, and stood back while 6 men ate in the particular urgent silence of people who are genuinely hungry. Nobody said anything for a while. The only sounds were spoons against tin and the stove doing its work and the wind outside, which had picked up since dark. Then Pete looked up from his plate. Ma'am, he said, where'd you find the salt pork? We thought we were out. Cellar, she said. He nodded slowly, as if this explained something larger than just the meal. Thought that might have been the case. Owen ate with the energy of a boy who has been existing on cold porridge and short rations, and is trying not to look like he's tasting something extraordinary, and failing completely. Silas ate quietly, methodically. The way a man eats when eating has become a function rather than a pleasure. But he ate all of it. And when he was done, he sat for a moment with his hands around his coffee cup. She'd found half a can of ground coffee tucked in the back of the shelf and made it strong enough to mean something, and he didn't leave the table right away. That was when Mara knew she'd done something that mattered more than supper. She'd made him stay. She stood at the wash basin, working on the dishes, when she heard him behind her. Room's off the back hallway, Silas said. Yours if you want the position. What's the wage, she asked. He named a figure. It was low. She almost said so. And then she looked around the kitchen at the warm stove, at the table where men were still sitting and talking in low voices, at Owen, who had fallen asleep in his chair with his chin on his chest, and she thought about the cold outside and the suitcase by the door, and the fact that she hadn't had a roof over her head that wasn't borrowed since October. That'll do, she said, for now. He almost said something. She could feel it, some response forming that he didn't quite let out. Instead, he just nodded and walked toward the hallway. He stopped at the doorway, didn't turn around. She used to make drop biscuits too, he said quietly. My wife. Mara kept her hands in the dishwater. They're good biscuits, she said carefully. Most anybody can make them if they know the feel of the dough. Pause. Yeah, he said, and then he was gone. She finished the dishes by the light of the kitchen lamp, listening to the stove settle and the wind push against the house and the occasional murmur from the front room where a couple of the hands were still talking. Owen was awake again, helping her dry, which she hadn't asked for but appreciated. Is it always this quiet? She asked him. Yes, he said. Then after a moment, it used to be different. Mara hung up the dishcloth. She looked at the kitchen, at the warm stove, and the clean table, and the small signs that something had shifted, even if just barely, even if just for tonight. It'll be different again, she said. Owen looked at her sideways. You don't know that? No, she said. I don't. She picked up her lamp and her suitcase and went to find her room. She didn't tell him she intended to make it true anyway. The next morning, Mara was up before anyone else. She had always been that way, even as a girl, something in her body, refusing to sleep, past the first pale suggestion of light. Some internal mechanism that treated darkness as a problem to be solved, rather than a comfort to be enjoyed. In the house where she'd grown up, that had made her useful. In the boarding house in Billings, it had made her indispensable. Here at Ember Hollow, in this cold and half-broken ranch, at the edge of everything, she figured it would make her exactly what she needed to be. She dressed into the dark, found her way to the kitchen by memory, and had the stove lit before the grace outside the window had done more than hint at morning. The pantry situation in the daylight was even more discouraging than it had appeared the night before. She stood in front of the shelves for a long moment, taking an honest inventory. The salt pork she'd used last night had left maybe 2 more meals worth if she was careful. The beans were low. The flour sack she'd used for biscuits was down to what she could cup in both hands. There was cornmeal a little, coffee enough for maybe 4 more days if she measured it right. Dried apples in a jar that had been there, long enough the apples were the color of old wood. No butter, no lard beyond what she'd already found. No potatoes. No onions, which was a particular problem, because onions were the thing that made other things taste like food instead of just sustenance. Pulled out the dried apples, smelled them. Still good. She put them in water to soak and started the coffee and told herself to think about one meal at a time instead of the whole catastrophe at once. That was a lesson she had learned young. Her father, in the years before his illness took the practical thinking away from him, used to say that a woman who can solve the problem in front of her is worth 10 who can plan 100 problems they haven't met yet. She had argued with him about that at 16. By 25, she'd stopped arguing. Silas came in while she was making oatmeal. He stopped in the doorway for a moment. She heard the pause before she saw it, and then he sat down at the table without saying anything. She poured him coffee and put it in front of him and went back to the stove. You're up early, he said finally. Habit, she said. Coffee's strong. I'll try to make it last, but I wasn't sure how you take it, Black, he said. It's fine. She waited, but nothing else came. Silas Rourke was a man who used silence, the way other men used furniture to fill space, to create a kind of order, to keep things from getting too close. She'd known men like that. Usually, they were either deeply private or deeply afraid, and the difference wasn't always obvious from the outside. The hands came in ones and twos, stomping cold from the yard. Pete came first, then a quiet older man named Dolph, who nodded at her and said nothing more, then 2 younger men, brothers by the look of them, named Cal and Ren, who were apparently incapable of entering a room without some ongoing low-level argument about something neither of them would remember by noon. Owen came down last, still tucking in his shirt, and Mara put a bowl in front of him before he'd even fully sat down. He looked at it, then at her. Apples, he said. In the oatmeal, she said. Don't make a face about it. He wasn't going to make a face. She could see that. He was just surprised. She suspected that meals here had become, in the years since Mrs. Rourke's death, a matter of filling the gap rather than providing any kind of actual pleasure. She watched them eat. This was a thing she had always done that people didn't notice because it didn't look like anything in particular. She just stood at the stove with her coffee and paid attention. She was learning them. Pete ate fast and without complaint and had the particular posture of a man who had worked physical labor his whole life and expected no comfort from it. Dolph ate slowly, chewing with great care, the way old men do when their teeth have opinions. The brothers argued about something between bites. Owen ate like he meant it. Silas ate the way he'd eaten last night. Present, but not quite there. When they were done, she set down her coffee cup and said, I need supplies. Silas looked up. I can work with what's here for another few days, she said, but I need to be honest with you about the pantry situation. It's low. I mean genuinely low, not just inconveniently low. If I'm going to feed 6 people 3 times a day, I need supplies within the week. flour, potatoes, large salt, onions. Whatever else you usually keep. Silas was quiet for a moment. The brothers had stopped arguing. Even Dolph looked up from his bowl. I know, Silas said. I've been meaning to get to town. The way he said it, meaning to told her everything she needed to know about how long that intention had been sitting unactioned, kept her face neutral. I can make a list, she said. Do that, he said, and stood up and took his hat off the peg and went outside, and the kitchen went back to its ordinary morning's sounds. Pete lingered while the others filed out. He was pulling on his gloves at the table, unhurried, in a way that she realized was deliberate. He'll go to town, Pete said without looking at her. He just needs a day or two to work up to it. Is that usual? Mara asked. Pete considered his answer with more care than the question seemed to require. Since Mrs. Rourke passed, he said, he does most things eventually, not on schedule. He stood up, tucked his gloves in his belt. You did good last night. The men noticed. He left before she could respond to that. She spent the morning doing what she could with what was there. Scoured the kitchen properly for the first time in what she estimated was several months, based months on the state of the corners and the grease buildup around the stove top. She reorganized the shelves so she could see at a glance what she had instead of discovering shortages by accident. She found behind a broken wooden box 3 jars of preserved tomatoes she hadn't seen in the cellar the night before. She also found a small tin of baking powder that was older than she would have liked, but still had some life in it, and a piece of hard cheese wrapped in cloth that she cut carefully, finding the middle still good. She was taking stock of the linen closet, not her job, strictly speaking, but the kitchen was done, and she needed to understand this house when Owen appeared in the hallway. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask, she said. Why'd you take this job? He said it without aggression, just with the genuine curiosity of someone who has been around adults long enough to know that they often have reasons they don't volunteer. Mara folded a dishcloth that was more whole than cloth and set it aside. Same reason most people take jobs, she said. I needed work. But all the way out here, he said. There's nothing out here. There's a house and 6 hungry people, she said. That's enough. Owen leaned against the wall, thinking about this. Mr. Rourke said the last cook quit after 10 days, he said the isolation got to her. I've been in more isolated places than this, Mara said, which wasn't entirely true but was close enough. Bother you, the elation? Sometimes, he said, honestly. In town I used to know where everything was. Out here everything's big. He paused. But it's better than the barn. She looked at him. Barn. He met her eyes briefly, then looked away. Before Mr. Rourke found me, I was sleeping in his barn. This was 2 winters ago. He came out one morning and found me, and he didn't throw me out. He just asked me if I could handle a pitchfork. Mara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, sounds like him. You've barely met him. I've met enough of him, she said, and went back to the linen closet. The days after that established themselves into a rhythm, the way days do when work is consistent, and the work itself has logic to it. Mara cooked 3 meals a day and kept the kitchen clean and made the supplies last longer than she would have thought possible through careful rationing and the application of techniques her mother had shown her in the years when rationing wasn't a choice. She made bone broth from the scraps. Pete brought her from the slaughter of an old steer she'd asked for them specifically, which had earned her a raised eyebrow from him, and then a nod of respect when he figured out what she was doing. The broth became the base for other things. A chain of usefulness that kept the pantry from running out entirely before Silas finally got to town. He came back from Caldwell on a Wednesday afternoon with a loaded wagon and the particular closed-down expression of a man who has been among people for longer than was comfortable and is now recovering. Owen helped him unload. Mara unpacked the supplies in the kitchen and said nothing about the fact that he'd thought to buy dried mushrooms and 2 kinds of dried chilies, which were not the kinds of things you bought if you just wanted to get through winter, but the kinds of things you bought if you remembered, somewhere underneath the forgetting, that food could taste like something. She filed that away. She was starting to collect a picture of Silas Rourke the way you collect a picture of any complicated place, not all at once, not from any single vantage point, but in pieces from different angles at different times of day. He was not what she had expected. Men who withdrew like that, who let their houses go to half ruin, and their pantries go bare, and their tables go silent, She had expected something broken in a way that felt permanent. What she was finding instead was something more like a door that had been locked from the ends inside, so long shut that the man behind it had half forgotten it could open. He was good with the cattle. She could see that in how the men talked about his decisions, in the small disagreements she occasionally overheard that resolved in his favor, not because he pulled rank, but because he was usually right. He was fair to the hands in a way that was clearly habitual rather than performed. He paid on time and didn't underfeed them, and took his share of the worst work without comment. He checked on Owen in a way that wasn't quite fatherly and wasn't quite not, the particular awkward care of someone who doesn't know how to be a parent but hasn't stopped trying. And he had started coming into the kitchen more. Not obviously, not making an occasion of it, but she noticed. He'd come in after the men had gone back to work and refill his coffee and stand at the window, looking out at the yard. And sometimes he would say something about what needed doing on the property, and she would respond, and they would have a conversation that was ostensibly practical, but felt, in ways she couldn't entirely explain, like two people quietly figuring out how much distance was actually between them. She was at the stove on a gray Friday afternoon, stirring a pot of beef stew with dried mushrooms that was going to be as close to good as she'd make it, when she heard a sound from the back of the house that stopped her hand. A crash. Something heavy, then silence. She was down the back hallway before she'd decided to move. The door to the small storeroom at the rear of the house stood open, and inside it, Silas was on one knee on the floor with one hand pressed to the top of a broken shelf and blood coming from somewhere on his forearm. The shelf gave, he said, as if explaining, I can see that. She came in, took his arm by the wrist, turned it to see. A cut, not deep, but long running from his elbow down toward his wrist along the outer edge, where a piece of broken wood had caught him. Come to the kitchen. I'm fine, he said. You're bleeding on the floorboards, she said. Come to the kitchen. He came. She had him sit at the table, and she cleaned the cut with water she'd boiled that morning for the laundry, which meant it was warm, and she pressed clean cloth against it and didn't speak while she worked. She had done this before for her father in the years when his hands had stopped cooperating with him. She had learned that the best thing to do while tending someone's wound was to not make it into a conversation about itself. Silas watched her work. She could feel his eyes without looking up. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. My father was ill for the last 3 years of his life, she said. He fell sometimes, I learned. A pause. How long ago did he die? 8 months. She pressed the cloth a little more firmly. My mother went in October, father in March. By November, the bank had the house. She said it plainly. The way you say things when you've had enough time with them that they've lost the power to knock you over, though they haven't lost the weight. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's a hard year, he said. It was. She checked the cut, slowing down. Good. People kept telling me I was young enough to start over, as if starting over is something you do because you're young. You do it because there isn't another choice. She looked up then and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not sympathy exactly, something closer to recognition. How old were you when Mrs. Rourke died? She sat. She hadn't meant to ask it, but it was out now. 36, he said. 32. What was her name? A beat. He was deciding something. Clara, he said. Mara tied off the bandage with the last piece of clean cloth she had. Tell Owen there's clean cloth in the top of the linen closet, she said, so he knows next time. Why would he need to know? Silas said. Because you're going to be in that storeroom fixing that shelf, she said, and you're going to hurt yourself again. Because you'll try to brace it with one hand and move things with the other, and Owen should know where the cloth is. She stood up, picked up the used rags. Or you could ask Pete to help you, which is the sensible option. Silas looked at the bandage on his arm. Then he looked at her. Most of its windows were dark. Something that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face and was gone. I'll ask Pete, he said. Good. She went to rinse her hands at the basin. Supper's at 6, don't be late. He wasn't late. In fact, he was at the table before anyone else, which was a new thing. She noticed and said nothing, and that was also a new thing. The weeks moved. February came in with a blizzard that kept everyone indoors for 3 days, and those 3 days taught Mara more about Ember Hollow and its people than the preceding weeks combined. Confined together, Without the structure of outdoor work to organize the hours, people showed their actual shapes. Cal and Ren played cards with the focused intensity of men who'd been arguing their whole lives and needed a controlled arena for it. Dolph mended tack by the fire with the patience of someone who had learned that most things worth doing were done slowly. Pete did figures ranch business, she thought, from the way he frowned at them at the kitchen table in the evenings, and didn't explain himself, and didn't need to. Owen read. He had a small collection of books that he kept in a wooden box under his bed, and during the blizzard, he went through 2 of them and then ran out and asked Mara if she had any. She had 3 in her suitcase. She gave him the one she thought he'd like. Silas moved through the blizzard days with the restlessness of a man who needed to be doing and had been temporarily deprived of that. He fixed things. He fixed the broken shelf in the storeroom with Pete's help, then fixed the section of porch railing that had been replaced by rope, then fixed a door hinge that had been stiff since before Mara arrived. She would hear the sounds of it, hammer saw, the occasional muttered word that she generously did not interpret as profanity, and understand that this was his version of staying calm. On the second day of the blizzard, he came into the kitchen while she was making bread. Real bread, from the good flour he'd brought from Caldwell, the first time she'd had enough to do it properly, and sat down at the table and watched her knead. Claire used to do that, he said. Then quickly, like he was trying to take it back. Sorry, I shouldn't. You can say her name, Mara said without stopping her hands. It doesn't bother me. Another silence. It bothers me sometimes, he said. Not because of not the way you might think. It bothers me because I'm never sure whether it's right to talk about her or not. Whether he stopped. Started again. The men don't bring her up. Owen doesn't, unless he forgets, and then he looks like he's committed a crime. I'm not sure who decided that, but somewhere along the way, it became the rule. Mara turned the dough. That's usually not a rule anyone decides, she said. It's just what happens when one person in a group is in enough pain that everyone else starts navigating around it. Silas looked at his hands on the table. I didn't know it was that visible, he said. Pain that size is always visible, she said. People just learn to look around it instead of at it. He didn't respond to that. She hadn't expected him to, not right away. There are things you say to people that they need to go off and live with before they can answer you, and she was learning which category this man put things in. The bread came out better than she'd hoped, not perfect. The oven ran a little hot on the left side, and she'd have to remember that, but good enough that Owen ate his first piece standing up at the counter before it was properly cool, burning his fingers and not caring. The blizzard broke on the 3rd morning. The light that came through the kitchen window afterward had the particular quality that follows a hard snow, very white, very still. The world scoured down to something cleaner than it was before. The men went out to check the cattle and the fences, and Mara stood on the porch for a moment before starting breakfast, just to breathe air that wasn't the recycled warmth of a house full of people. She was still standing there when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard. A single horse, coming from the direction of the main road, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who has a destination and an agenda rather than someone out checking stock. The man who rode up was not from the valley. She knew that, without quite knowing how she knew it, something in the way he sat the horse, the quality of his coat, the fact that his boots were clean despite the road conditions, which meant he'd been stationary somewhere dry until recently, stopped in the yard and looked at the house, assessing look of someone calculating a value. Morning, he said when he noticed her. I'm looking for Silas Rourke. He's out checking the cattle, she said. What's your business? He smiled, the kind of smile that is shaped like a smile, but doesn't have anything underneath it. Just a conversation, he said. A business matter. I'll wait. She went inside and stood at the kitchen window and watched him wait in the yard, not dismounting, not fidgeting, just sitting his horse with the patience of a man who has all the time in the world because he's already got what he wants, and the other person just doesn't know it yet. Something about him made her stomach tighten. She was still at the window when Silas came back in through the back door, and she said, There's a man in the yard. He says he has a business matter. Silas looked past her out the window, and she saw something shift in his face, not recognition, but something close to it. Something like a confirmation of a thing he'd been half expecting and wholly dreading. That's Gideon Price, he said. Who's Gideon Price? Silas was quiet for a moment. taking his coat off with the careful movements of a man who is using activity to think. Land agent, he said finally. Works for someone out of Helena. He's been around the valley a few times in the past year. He set his coat on the peg. I've been avoiding him. Why? Mara asked. Silas looked at her steadily. Because the last time a man like that wanted to talk to me, he said, was the day before we almost lost this place the first time. 7 years ago. Different man, same kind of smooth. He picked up his hat. I'll go hear what he has to say. I'll put coffee on, Mara said. Silas paused. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. She put the coffee on, and she also did not leave the kitchen. She moved around it in the way a person moves around a room when they're organizing things that don't need organizing, staying within earshot of the front room where Silas had brought Price in. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't spying. She was cooking, which happened to require her to be in the kitchen, which happened to share a wall with the front room, and if she could hear a word here and there, that was simply the architecture of the building. What she heard was enough. Not every word, but enough. Phrases. Loan transfer. Outstanding balance. Accelerated timeline. Investors with an interest in the property. And then, clearly, because Price didn't seem to feel the need to lower his voice for the hired help, the offer is fair, Mr. Rourke. Fairer than you'll get when this goes to the court. She was pouring the coffee into cups when Silas came back to the kitchen. Alone. Price apparently had declined the coffee. Silas sat down at the table. He didn't speak right away. He picked up the coffee and held it, and she sat down across from him and waited. He says the loan on Ember Hollow has been purchased, Silas said. His voice was very controlled. By an investment group out of Helena, and the terms have been accelerated. He looked at his coffee. I have until the end of May to pay the outstanding balance in full, or give up the property. The end of May was 14 weeks away. What's the outstanding balance? Mara asked. He told her. She kept her face still. It was a lot. For a working cattle ranch that had been running on thin margins for 4 years, it was more than a lot. It was, as far as she could see on the surface of it, impossible. Can you get to the bank in Caldwell? She said. The bank in Caldwell holds the original loan, he said. Or it did. Price showed me documentation transfer papers. It's been purchased. Legally, as far as I can tell. As far as you can tell, Mara said. He looked at her. What? You said as far as you can tell, she said. That means you're not certain. Silas was quiet for a moment, and she could see him turning something over, considering whether to dismiss what she was saying or take it seriously. I'm not a lawyer, he said. No, she said. But is there one you could talk to? In Caldwell or otherwise? He was very still for a long moment. Then he said, there's a man, territorial attorney, handled some property work for my father before he died. Caleb Stroud. He's in Billings now. That's not close, Mara said. No, Silas said, it's not. She wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup and thought. The stove behind her was working steadily, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and the remnants of the bread from yesterday, and outside the window the snow-scoured world was very white and very cold. And a man had just told Silas Rourke that he had 14 weeks to produce an amount of money that was on its face impossible. She thought about the transfer papers, the legal language of acceleration, the investment group out of Helena, the fact that Price had arrived the day after a blizzard that had kept everyone on the property for 3 days, which meant he'd been somewhere nearby waiting for it to clear, which meant this visit was deliberate and timed. People who time their visits like that are not offering you a fair deal. Don't give him an answer yet, she said. Silas looked at her. I haven't. Good, she said. Don't. Not until you've talked to someone who understands the legal side of a loan transfer. She paused. Where are your financial documents? The original loan papers, the payment records, everything. Blinked. In the box in my study. Why? Because before you decide what's possible, she said, I want to understand what you're actually dealing with. She stood up, picked up her coffee. Bring me the papers tonight. After supper, I'll look at them. He stared at her. You're the cook, he said. Not unkindly. Just stating. I know what I was hired to do, she said. Most of its windows were dark. I also know arithmetic and I know how to read a contract because I read every piece of paper my father signed in his last 3 years, and some of them were written by people trying to take advantage of a sick man, and I learned what that looks like. She met his eyes. You cannot bring me the papers. And that's your right. But I'll tell you what I told myself when I walked into this kitchen and found a cold stove and nothing in the pantry. She set down her cup. The situation looks worse than it is, or it looks exactly as bad as it is. Either way, the only thing that changes it is doing something. Silas looked at her for a long, still moment. Then he stood up and took his cup to the basin and said, "I'll bring them after supper." He brought them. All of them the original loan papers, the payment ledger, the deeds, a folder of correspondence she hadn't expected and which turned out to be more informative than any of the official documents. She spread them on the kitchen table after the men had gone to bed, and Owen, who had heard movement and come downstairs, sat at the other end of the table doing his best to look helpful. Silas sat across from her and watched her read. She was not fast, careful. She had learned from her father's situation that speed with documents is how you miss the thing that matters. And the thing that matters is usually written in the smallest print, in the most ordinary-looking clause, in the place where your eye wants to slide past and keep going. She found two things that mattered. The first was in the payment ledger. Silas had been making payments not always on time, but consistently, and the amounts were documented in his hand and in the bank's receipts. There was no record of a formal default, which meant the loan, as far as she could read it, had not been in technical default when it was purchased. The second was in the transfer papers Price had left, a clause buried in the middle of the second page that specified the conditions under which a purchased loan could be accelerated. She read it 3 times to be sure she was reading it right. Then she looked up at Silas. "Did the bank notify you before this loan was sold?" she asked. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "In writing," she said. "Did anyone from the Caldwell Bank send you written notice that your loan was being sold to another party?" Silas thought. "No," he said slowly. "I heard rumors other ranchers talking about their loans moving around, but nothing official, no letter. And these transfer papers," she said, pointing. "They're dated January 3rd of this year." "Yes," he said. "But you never received a copy until today," she said. "Price handed them to you himself." Silas's eyes moved to the papers. She watched him seeing what she was seeing. "This clause," she said, putting her finger on the second page, "requires written notification to the original borrower before a loan can be legally transferred to a new holder. That notification wasn't given." She stopped. She was not a lawyer. She knew better than to finish that sentence with more certainty than she had. This is why you need Caleb Stroud. Silas was very quiet. He looked at the papers, and then at her. Most of its windows were dark, and the expression on his face was complicated in a way she didn't try to interpret. There was something like relief in it, but relief was fragile, and she'd learned not to hand people fragile things without warning them to hold on. "You found that," he said. And he looked at the papers spread across the table. "In 2 hours I was looking for it," she said simply. "When someone tells you a situation is impossible, the first thing you do is look for the part they're not mentioning." Owen, at the end of the table, had forgotten to pretend he was doing anything other than listening. He was just watching them both, very awake, very still. Silas gathered the papers carefully. "The way you handle something you've been underestimating." "I'll go to Billings," he said. "I'll see Caleb." "Good," she said. "It'll take a few days. Maybe more." He looked up. "Can you manage the ranch while I'm gone?" She held his gaze. "The men are here," she said. "Owen's here. I'll manage the kitchen and whatever else needs managing." She paused. "Go find out if we're actually as cornered as Price wants you to think." Silas nodded. Slowly, he started to say something and didn't. And she understood that there were words that needed more space than a kitchen table at midnight to be said properly, and she wasn't going to force them. "Get some sleep," she said. "You'll want an early start." He went. Owen stayed at the table a moment longer, looking at her across the spread of papers with an expression she recognized. She'd worn it herself at 16, watching her father handle a bad situation with more steadiness than the situation deserved. "You think it's going to be okay?" Owen asked. Mara started gathering the papers back into their folder, organizing them the way she organized everything carefully, with attention to what was what. "I think it might not be as bad as it looked at 3 o'clock this afternoon," she said. "Whether it's going to be okay depends on a lot of things I can't know yet." Owen nodded, taking this seriously in the way he took most things seriously. He stood up to go back to bed, and then stopped in the doorway. "Mrs. Rourke, Clara, she used to sit up late too," he said, "going over things. Silas used to say she was the one who kept the books straight." Mara looked at him. "Go to bed, Owen," she said, not unkindly. He went. She sat alone at the kitchen table for a while longer, the papers squared in their folder in front of her, the stove low but still warm, the house around her, making the small sounds that houses make at night when they think no one is listening. Outside, the Montana dark was total and cold, and 14 weeks felt like either a very long time or no time at all, depending on where you were standing. She was standing in a kitchen. She had spent 3 weeks in turning from a cold, dead room into something that functioned. She had done it once. She could work with what came next. She banked the stove, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. Silas left before dawn. Mara heard him in the yard, the particular sounds of a man preparing for a long ride when he doesn't want to wake the house, which meant she heard everything, because men who are trying to be quiet are never as quiet as they think. Boots on the porch boards, the creak of the barn door, the low sound of a horse being saddled and talked to in the way that men talk to horses when they won't talk to people. She got up and went to the kitchen and had coffee ready by the time he came to the back door to say he was leaving. He stopped when he saw the cup waiting on the table. Just for a moment, the kind of stop that a person makes when they've gotten used to being surprised by small kindnesses. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. She was already at the stove, starting the morning fire. "The papers are in the folder on the shelf there. I wrote notes on a separate sheet the clause I found. The questions I think Stroud needs to answer. Take it with you." He picked up the folder. He opened it, saw the notes in her handwriting, careful, small, organized in a way that must have taken her the better part of an hour after he'd gone to bed. He looked at her for a moment, and she kept her attention on the stove. "Mara," he said. She turned. He seemed to be doing the thing where a man has several sentences lined up and is trying to decide which one is the right one. In the end, he said, "Don't let Price onto the property while I'm gone, not without someone else present." "I wasn't planning to," she said. He nodded, picked up his coffee, drank it standing, set the cup back on the table. "I'll be back by Friday. Saturday at the outside." "Go," she said. "We'll be here." She listened to the sound of him riding out until it was gone and the morning was just morning again, when the distant sound of cattle, the stove beginning to talk as the fire caught. She stood there for a moment with her hands around her own coffee cup and felt the weight of the house settle differently without him in it. Not worse, just different. More hers, in a way she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely sure how to feel about. She told Pete at breakfast that Silas had gone to Billings on business and would be back by the weekend. Pete received this information with the particular nod of a man who'd been given exactly the amount of information that was being offered and knew better than to ask for more. The brothers exchanged a look. Dolph continued eating. Owen stared at his oatmeal with the focused attention of someone pretending not to have overheard most of the kitchen conversation the night before. Pete asked. "Far as I know," Mara said. "Mr. Rourke left no other instructions." Pete nodded and stood up, and that was the end of that, which was one of the things she was beginning to genuinely appreciate about Pete. The day passed in its ordinary shape. She baked, she sorted. She took an inventory of the wood supply and determined they needed another cord before the end of March, which she wrote on the list she was keeping on the inside cover of the kitchen ledger. She found that one of the windows in the back bedroom had a gap in the frame that let in a cold draft along the baseboard, and she stuffed it with cloth and noted it for proper repair. She checked the cellar in the afternoon and found a small jar of preserved plums she'd somehow missed before, tucked up behind a bag of dried corn, and she brought them up and set them on the shelf like a small victory. The first truly odd thing happened the following morning. She was out in the yard getting a bucket of water from the well when she saw the rider. Not on the road off to the east along the tree line that marked the far edge of the near pasture. Sitting still on a gray horse, just watching. She watched back. After a few minutes, the rider turned and went back into the trees and was gone. She didn't say anything to the men right away. She went back inside and finished what she was doing and thought about it. One rider on the property boundary wasn't necessarily anything. This was open country. People rode across it. But the sitting still and watching was a specific behavior, and specific behaviors had specific meanings. And she had grown up watching her father read the intentions of men who showed up on their property under various pretexts, and she had learned that the pretexts were rarely the point. She mentioned it to Pete when he came in for his midday meal. He set down his fork. "East fence line, you said?" "Along the tree line." Yes. Pete chewed the inside of his cheek, which was something he did when he was thinking hard and didn't want it to show. Gray horse, he said. Stocky built? I couldn't say about the build from that distance, she said. Gray horse, still rider. Maybe 20 minutes of just watching. Pete looked at Cal and Wren, who were eating with the studied nonchalance of men who are paying close attention. I'll ride out this afternoon and check the fence. I'd appreciate that, Mara said. He went. He came back at dusk, looking more settled than he'd gone out, which she interpreted as the fence being intact, but the expression underneath the settled look was something else. Fence is fine, he said before she could ask, but there are tracks out there. More than one rider. Different days looks like different depths in the snow, some older. Mara kept her hands busy with supper preparations. How many? 2 sets, maybe 3. Hard to tell. Pete sat down at the table and looked at her directly, which he didn't always do. You think this is connected to price? I think, she said carefully, that a land agent representing people who want this property probably wants more information about this property than Mr. Rourke would voluntarily give him. Pete was quiet for a moment. So they're looking. Maybe, she said, or maybe they're just making sure we know they're looking. She turned back to the stove. I want to know if you see anyone on that fence line again. Immediately. Yes, ma'am, Pete said, and the ma'am was not ironic. She wrote it in the ledger that night. The rider, the tracks, the dates, Pete's account. She didn't know why she did it, exactly some instinct about documentation that she'd developed watching her father's situation deteriorate, partly because nothing had been written down at the right time. If this became something larger, she wanted a record of when it started. The soot of its windows were dark. She was still writing when Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, his hair at the angle that meant he'd been lying awake rather than asleep. Who's out there? He said. She looked up. You saw the rider too? Yesterday morning, he said. From the Seapser's window. I didn't want to say anything and worry the men. Mara set down her pen. Owen, what happens on this ranch is not something you manage by not saying things. If you see something, you tell me or you tell Pete. That's how we keep everyone accounted for. He took this seriously, in the way he took correction seriously, not defensively, just absorbing it. Okay, he said. He came and sat down across from her, looking at the ledger. What are you writing? A record, she said, dates, times. What happened? Who saw it? Why? She thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being frightening. Because if someone is trying to take something from you, she said, the most important thing you can have is proof of what they did and when they did it. Owen looked at the ledger. Do you think they're going to take the ranch? Not if I can help it, she said. The words were out before she decided to say them, which surprised her a little. She meant them. She wasn't entirely sure when that had happened, when Ember Hollow had shifted from a job to something she felt personally about, but it had. And there it was. Owen was watching her with that direct look he had, the one that made him seem older than 16. You've been here less than 2 months, he said. I know, she said. Why do you care so much? Mara looked at the window, the dark glass showing her nothing but the reflection of the kitchen and Owen's face and her own. My family lost their property, she said. Not because they were foolish or irresponsible. Because someone with more money and more lawyers found a way to make the law work for them instead of for us. She turned back to Owen. I know what it looks like when it's happening, and I know what it feels like when it's too late to stop it. She picked up her pen. I'd rather know that feeling than do nothing. Owen was quiet for a while. Then he said, I don't have anything. I've never had anything. So I don't know if I'd fight for it the way you're talking about. You'd be surprised, she said. People fight hardest for things they didn't think they had until the moment someone tried to take them. He went back to bed. She sat with the ledger and the lamp and the sound of the stove for another hour before she trusted herself to sleep. The next day brought Agnes Bellwether. Mara had not yet met the woman who owned the neighboring spreads to the south, had heard her name from Pete once and from Owen twice, in the context of someone who occasionally sent over extra eggs when her hens were producing well and who had the particular reputation of a woman who says what she thinks and doesn't chase you down to apologize for it. She arrived mid-morning in a wagon she drove herself, a small woman in her 60s, with the posture of someone who has spent a lifetime making sure people don't mistake small for insignificant. She came to the kitchen door rather than the front, which Mara took as a good sign. You're the cook, Agnes said. looking at her with a frank assessment that Mara found more refreshing than most people's pleasantries. "Mara, Ellison," Mara said. "Come in." Agnes came in and sat down and accepted coffee and looked around the kitchen with the particular eye of someone noting what has changed. "Better than it was," she said. "Last time I was in here, the stove was barely lit, and I'm not sure anyone had swept since autumn. November, I'd estimate," Mara said. "Sit down, I have biscuits." Agnes sat and ate a biscuit with genuine appreciation, and then looked at Mara with the look of someone who has come to say something specific and is deciding on the approach. "Silas is in Billings. She's not a question." "Yes," Mara said. "Gideon Price," Agnes said, also not a question. Mara looked at her steadily. "You know him." "I know of him," Agnes said, and the distinction was clearly intentional. "He came to my place 3 weeks ago. Before the blizzard. Different offer. Same shape, very polite, very reasonable. Very much the face of someone delivering a message from someone else." She set down her coffee cup. "He told me my loan terms had changed too." Mara's chest tightened. "The same situation as Silas?" "Similar enough," Agnes said. "Different amounts, different timeline, but the same structure: loan purchased, terms accelerated, offers extended to make it easy for me to just hand over the deed and walk away." She looked out the kitchen window. "I've been running the bellwether spread for 30 years, Miss Ellison. My husband built the first fence post on that property with his own hands. Told Price what he could do with his offer." "Good," Mara said. "But here's the thing." Agnes turned back to her, and her eyes were very sharp. "After he left, I started asking around, quietly, talking to other ranchers in the valley." She paused. "In the past 2 years, 4 properties have changed hands. All of them had loans that were purchased and accelerated. 2 of the owners gave up without much of a fight: Harlan Meeks over on the North Fork, and the Prentice family on Cedar Road. The other 2 held on longer but eventually went." She looked at Mara steadily. "Ember Hollow is the 5th. Mara sat very still. "Who's behind Price?" she asked. Agnes said, "Man named Lucius Vane. Banker out of Helena. Has interests in land, in water rights, in timber. Not a man who makes small moves." She folded her hands on the table. "The properties he's accumulated in this valley, Miss Ellison, if you drew a map, Ember Hollow sits right in the middle of all of them. The last piece." There it was. Mara had suspected something like this. The logic of what Price was doing had felt too organized for simple opportunism, but hearing it said plainly by someone who had done the work of connecting the pieces put it in a different register entirely. This was not a man who had found a struggling ranch and decided to take advantage. This was a man who had spent 2 years building toward a specific outcome, and Ember Hollow was the keystone, which meant the pressure on Silas was not going to ease if he found a way to delay. It was going to increase. "You need to tell Silas this," Mara said. "I plan to when he's back," Agnes said. "But I came here first because—" She stopped, seemed to be deciding something. "Because the women on these properties are usually the ones keeping track of things. The men run the cattle and sign the papers, and don't always see the full picture because they're in it. The women—" She made a small gesture. "We talk to each other." Mara thought of the ledger with its careful entries. "Has anyone else been watching boundary lines?" she asked. "Riders on fence lines that don't belong there." Agnes went still. "Yes," she said. "I had a rider on my south fence twice last week." "Same here," Mara said. "East fence line." Pete found tracks from multiple days. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, 2 women who had never met before this morning, and in that look was the particular understanding that passes between people who have independently arrived at the same conclusion about a dangerous situation. "I'm keeping a written record," Mara said. "Dates, times, observations. If you're willing, I'd like you to do the same." Agnes raised an eyebrow, and in it was something that looked like respect. "You've got a sharp head for trouble," she said. "I've had some experience with it," Mara said. Agnes left an hour later, with 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth for the ride home and the promise to send word if she saw anything further on her fence line. Mara stood on the porch watching her wagon go and felt the cold very clearly, felt the empty land around Ember Hollow clearly, felt the particular weight of a problem that had just gotten both larger and more specific. She went inside and sat down with the ledger and added everything Agnes had told her. The names, the properties, the timeline, the name Lucius Vane, which she wrote carefully and underlined once. Then she started a second page. A map, drawn as well as she could manage, without actually having walked the valley, marking what she knew of the properties Agnes had named, where they were relative to Ember Hollow, the rough shape of what Vane was assembling. She drew it from Agnes's description, filling in the gaps where she could, and when she was done she sat back and looked at it, and felt a cold clarity settle over her that was different from anger, different from fear. It was the feeling she got when she understood the full shape of a problem. Not comfortable but solid. You couldn't fight something you couldn't see. Now she could see it. She was folding the map back into the ledger when Owen came in from outside, foam stamping snow off his boots, face red from the cold. "Pete wants to know if you need anything from the barn," he said. Then he stopped, reading her face with that directness he had. "What happened?" "I had a visit from Agnes Bellwether," she said. "She's good people," Owen said automatically. And then, what'd she say? Mara looked at him. He was 16. He lived here. Whatever happened to Ember Hollow happened to him too, perhaps more than to anyone else in the house, because he had nothing else and nowhere else. And she was not going to lie to him or smooth over what she'd learned, because he was young. "She told me who's behind Price," she said, "and why Ember Hollow matters so much to him." She told him. All of it. Owen listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him he could hold still and really hear, which was rarer in any person than it should have been. When she was done, he sat down at the table, slowly, like the weight of it had settled on him. "So they're not going to stop," he said. "Even if Silas finds something wrong with the papers." "Probably not," Mara said. "Men who build something this carefully don't stop because one piece doesn't fall right. They look for another way." Owen was quiet for a long time, looking at the ledger. "What are we going to do while Silas is gone?" "We're going to keep the ranch running," she said. "And we're going to keep recording everything we see. And we're going to make sure there's nothing here that Vane or Price can exploit that we haven't already seen and prepared for." She paused. "I need to go over the property more carefully. The boundaries, specifically. Agnes mentioned water rights. I need to understand what the ranch has and what a man acquiring the surrounding land might be able to do with a water claim." Owen straightened up. "There's an old map," he said. "Property. Silas keeps it in the flat drawer in his study with the survey documents." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Silas showed me once," he said. "When I first came here, he showed me the whole property on the map, told me where the boundaries were and why they mattered." He paused, and something moved across his face. He said a man ought to know what he's standing on. She fetched the map. She spread it on the kitchen table, and Owen stood beside her, and they looked at it together, the property lines, the crike that ran along the northern edge, the easements marked in faded ink that she had to hold the lamp close to read properly. That was where she found it. Near the eastern boundary, the same boundary where the riders had been watching, there was a notation in old ink about a water easement. The language was cramped and faded, but she could make it out. A right of passage for water access granted to a prior neighboring property, running through the eastern corner of Ember Hollow's land. She read it 3 times. "What does that mean?" Owen asked. "Means," she said slowly, working through it, that there is a legal right, attached to the property on the other side of that eastern fence, to access water through the corner of this land." She looked at Owen. "If Vane owns the properties on the other side of the eastern fence—" "He does," Owen said quietly. "That was Harlan Meeks's place. It was one of the ones Agnes said he took." Mara stood up straight. "Then he already has a legal foot on this land," she said. "The easement gives him access rights. If he wanted to challenge how that easement is being used, or claim it's being blocked, it would give him a basis to bring a legal action. Another way in, separate from the loan." Owen stared at her. "So the riders on the fence line were checking whether they could argue we were interfering with the easement," she said, "building a second case, in case the first one doesn't hold." Kitchen was very quiet. Mara thought about Lucius Vane, whom she had never met, sitting in his office in Helena, building his chess game one piece at a time, patient and methodical, buying up distressed loans and counting on the owners to be too exhausted and too isolated to see the full picture until it was too late. She thought about the Meeks family and the Prentices and the 2 others Agnes had named. Most of its windows were dark, and she thought about how it must have felt to them, to each of them, when they realized what had happened. When the walls had already closed, she was not going to let that happen here. "We need to document the easement," she said. "Exactly as it's written, exactly as it appears in the original survey. We need to note that we're aware of it, and we need to make absolutely certain there's nothing on that eastern fence line that could be construed as a barrier to the access it describes. She looked at Owen. First thing tomorrow, I want to walk that fence line with Pete. Yes, she said, in this cold. Owen looked at her for a moment. You walk fence lines too? I walk whatever needs walking, she said. She went the next morning with Pete in weather that had dropped overnight to the kind of cold that hurts your face in the specific way that the air itself has turned hostile. Pete didn't complain, and neither did she. They walked the eastern fence from the north corner to the south, Pete checking the wire while Mara looked at the ground, at the access point marked on the old survey map, at the frozen ground where the tracks had been. The access point was clear. Nothing blocked it. No fence crosses it, no structure. No stored materials. As far as she could see, Ember Hollow had never interfered with the easement, which meant Vane could document it and use it as leverage, but couldn't claim obstruction. Yet, if someone wanted to make it look like we were blocking access, she said to Pete, standing at the corner where the easement ran, what would they do? Pete thought about it. Move some lumber near the corner, maybe, or string extra wire. Make it look like a fence was going up. Could someone have done that from the outside? She asked. From the other side of the boundary. Pete looked at the fences, at the angles, at the land. He didn't answer right away. That was the answer. We put nothing near this corner, Mara said. And if anything appears here that didn't come from us, I want to know within the hour. Pete nodded, and in his eyes was the look of a man who has fully transferred his assessment of a situation from one category to another. He had come to Ember Hollow to work for Silas Rourke. He was, now she could see, also working for something else, the specific resistance that forms in a person when they understand exactly what they're up against and decide they're not moving. They walked back in the cold, and she made hot coffee, and nobody said much because everything necessary had already been said in the field. That afternoon brought the thing she had been dreading in the back of her mind without quite putting a name to it. Price came back. She heard the horse and looked out the window and felt her jaw set in a way she recognized as the physical symptom of a decision already made somewhere below the level of conscious thought. She took off her apron. She checked that Owen was upstairs. He was. She could hear him moving above the kitchen. She told Pete, who had come in for water, with a glance and a tilt of her head toward the window, and Pete straightened and stayed. Price knocked at the front door. She opened it. He was as smooth as she remembered, well-dressed for the conditions. That clean boot quality. Dips this it. He smiled at her with the slightly condescending warmth of a man who has concluded that the woman in front of him is not a decision-maker and can be managed accordingly. Miss Ellison, he said, is Mr. Rourke available? Mr. Rourke is away on business, she said. Can I help you? Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. The smile didn't change, but something behind it made a small adjustment. I'd rather speak with him directly, he said. Do you know when he'll return? I'm not certain, she said. Perhaps I could come in and wait, he said. Mr. Price, she said, and she kept her voice very even, very pleasant, the way you keep a surface calm when the current under it is moving fast. I'm happy to let Mr. Rourke know you called. If you'd like to leave a message, I'll make sure he receives it. The smile stayed on his face, but his eyes had gone to a different temperature. He looked at her for a long moment with the specific look of a man recategorizing a situation. See, he said. The message, she said, a beat. Tell him the timeline hasn't changed, Price said, and that extensions aren't part of what's being offered. Tell him, she said. She closed the door. She stood behind it and listened to his horse leave the yard, and then she waited until the sound count was gone before she let herself breathe in the particular way that you breathe when something you were bracing for has passed. Pete appeared from the back hallway. He gone? For now, she said. She went to the ledger and wrote it down. The time, the words. Timeline hasn't changed. Extensions aren't being offered. She wrote it exactly as Price had said it, and closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf. Owen appeared at the kitchen doorway. He had been upstairs long enough that she suspected he'd been at the window. He'll come back, Owen said. Yes, she said. With more people, maybe. She looked at him. Probably. Owen folded his arms the way he did when he was thinking about something he didn't want to say directly. Can we actually fight this? Silas? And you and all of us? Against someone who's been doing this for 2 years and has lawyers and money? She had asked herself the same question more than once, in different ways, in the hours since Agnes Bellwether had put a name and a face and a plan to what they were dealing with. She had not arrived at satisfying answers, because satisfying answers were generally not available at this stage of a problem. What was available was the next thing to do. We can fight it as long as we're still standing, she said. We have the loan question for Stroud. We have the easement documented. We have the boundary records. We have Agnes and whatever she's gathering from her end. She looked at him steadily. The people who lose these fights, Owen, are mostly the ones who give up before the other side has finished building their case. We're not giving up. He looked at her for a long moment. You sound like you've done this before, he said. I've lost one, she said. I don't intend to lose another. That night she wrote a letter to Silas. Not about the ledger or the legal question. Pete was due to ride to Caldwell the next day and could post it. She wrote it carefully, choosing every word with the awareness that letters could be read by other eyes. She told him that they had received a visit from Price and that the timeline remained as stated. She told him she had spoken with Agnes Bellwether and had come across some additional information about the property surveys that he would want to discuss with Stroud. She told him the men were well and the cattle were accounted for and the pantry was holding. She did not write that she was afraid because she wasn't. Exactly. What she was aware acutely, completely aware of the shape of the thing they were in, the way you're aware of a bad storm when you can smell it before it arrives. You can be afraid of a storm, or you can spend the time it's coming doing everything possible to be ready when it hits. She sealed the letter and set it on the shelf for Pete in the morning. Banked the stove. She checked the locks on the doors. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking out at the cold dark where the eastern fence line ran invisible against the night sky, and she thought about Lucius Vane in his office in Helena, who had never seen this kitchen or felt this cold or known a single name among the people whose futures he had been rearranging like pieces on a board. She thought, he doesn't know about the easement notation in the original survey. He doesn't know she found it. He doesn't know about Agnes's records, or her own, or the letter already on its way to a territorial attorney named Caleb Stroud. He thought he was waiting for a tired rancher to come home and give up. He was about to discover that considerably more had been happening at Ember Hollow than he'd accounted for. She turned off the lamp and went to bed, and the house settled into its night sounds around her, the stove, the wind, the old wood of the walls contracting in the cold, Owen shifting in his sleep above the kitchen, Pete's low voice through the bunkhouse wall, saying something to one of the brothers, then going quiet. A house full of people she had known for less than 2 months, in a place she had come to, looking for nothing more than a roof and wages. She lay in the dark and felt the particular weight of caring about something you hadn't meant to care about, which is heavier than the weight of things you set out to carry because it catches you unprepared. She had not come to Ember Hollow to fight anyone's battle. She had come because she needed work and the pantry needed filling, and a cold stove was a problem she knew how to solve. But here she was. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind, and when sleep finally came for her, she let it. Silas came back on a Friday evening, 2 days later than he'd said. Mara heard the horse in the yard at dusk and felt something in her chest unknot that she hadn't fully acknowledged was knotted. She was at the stove. She was always at the stove at that hour, and she kept her hands on what she was doing while Owen went to the door and Pete stepped out from the bunkhouse, and the ordinary sounds of a man returning home moved through the yard. He came in through the back door looking tired in the deep way. The way that wasn't just the body but the whole person. His coat was road dusty, and his jaw carried several days of stubble, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who's been turning something over for a long time without setting it down. He stopped inside the door and looked at the kitchen, the lamp, the stove, the table already set for supper, and something in his face shifted in a way she'd learned to recognize. Not relief exactly, more like the specific exhale of a person arriving somewhere that is still the place they left. Sit down, she said. I'll get you coffee. He sat. Owen sat across from him, barely managing to contain the question he'd been saving for 2 days. Pete appeared in the doorway, assessed the situation with his usual economy, and leaned against the frame with his arms folded rather than coming in. Silas wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she set in front of him. Caleb Stroud sends his regards, he said to the room in general. Then to Mara specifically, your notes were good. Clause you marked, he said you identified it correctly. What does it mean? Owen asked. Silas looked at his coffee. The loan transfer was not properly executed, he said. The bank in Caldwell was required by territorial law to notify me in writing before selling the loan. That notification was never sent. Stroud says that failure doesn't automatically void the transfer, but it creates a significant procedural challenge that Vane's people will have to answer in court. He paused. And there's more. Stroud has been watching Vane for a while longer than we knew. He says 2 other ranchers in other valleys have come to him with similar complaints about similar transactions. The same structure, the same investors, the same failure to follow notification procedure. Pete unfolded his arms. So it's a pattern. It's a pattern, Silas said. Which means if we can make this legal challenge, we're not just fighting for Ember Hollow. We're providing evidence that Stroud can use to challenge the whole structure. Kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was doing its ordinary Montana business against the eaves, and the stove was doing its ordinary work. And in the middle of all that ordinary everything sat the extraordinary weight of what Silas had just put on the table. There's something else you need to know, Marissa said. She told him about Agnes Bellwether's visit. She told him about Lucius Vane, the map of properties, the 2 years of accumulated acquisitions, the way Ember Hollow sat at the center of everything Vane had been building. She watched his face as she talked, watched him absorb the scale of it, the premeditation of it, the fact that this had never been about one struggling ranch and one man's grief-dulled inattention, but about something much larger and much colder than that. She told him about the easement. That was the one that made him go completely still. Show me, he said. She got the survey map and spread it on the table. She showed him the notation, the eastern corner, the right of access that had been granted to what was now Vane's property. She showed him her ledger entries, the riders on the fence finesse line, Pete's account of the tracks, the dates. Silas looked at the map for a long time without speaking. He's already in the valley, he said finally. The access right to that corner, it's been on the original survey for 20 years. I never stopped. His jaw tightened. I never looked at it. It never mattered before because Harlan Meeks wasn't a problem. He's not the problem now either, Mara said. Vane is. And I don't think he's tried to act on the easement yet. I think the writers were checking whether they could manufacture a claim that we were interfering with it. There's nothing at that corner. No obstruction. Pete and I walked it. Silas looked up from the map. Something in the way he looked at her was different, not the surface of it. Not in any way she could have described precisely, but underneath the tiredness and the dust and the weight of what he'd brought back from Billings, there was something that was not quite the same as the way he'd looked at her 2 weeks ago. You and Pete walked the fence line, he said. In the cold, Pete confirmed from the doorway. Silas looked between them. Then he looked at Mara. You wrote all of it down, he said. It's in the ledger, she said. Every rider, every date, Price's visit, Agnes's account, the easement notation. All of it sourced and dated. She paused. Stroud is going to need documentation. I wanted to make sure we had it. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Owen was watching him, the way the boy watched everything completely carefully with that quality of attention that took in more than what was being said. I should have been paying attention, Silas said. Not to anyone in particular. Saying it like a man who has been having the conversation with himself for the better part of 2 days on the road. To the loan, to the neighbors, to the all of it. I knew things were tight. I didn't want to see how tight. You're paying attention now, Pete said, flat and clean, the way Pete said things. Silas looked at him. Something moved between them, some old language of men who have worked the same hard ground together for years and don't need much to communicate across it. Yeah, Silas said, I am. He ate supper with the men that night, really ate at the table, in the middle of the conversation, not off to the side of it. Cal and Wren had apparently decided that the seriousness of the situation deserved a temporary ceasefire in their ongoing low-level war, and the kitchen had a different quality to it than it had in the preceding days. More weight, but also more presence. Everyone in their actual place, rather than navigating around the space where one person wasn't. Afterward, when the men had gone and Owen had been firmly directed toward bed, Silas stayed at the table. Mara cleaned up, moving through the kitchen with the efficient, quiet of someone who has made the same movements enough times to do them without thinking. She was aware of him behind her in the way she was often aware of him, not intrusively, just as a presence that had gradually become part of the room's ordinary accounting. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. She turned around. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the surface of the table, his hands flat on it, as if he was considering the grain of the wood. "When I came back from Billings and you'd the fence line, the ledger, the letter you sent through Pete." He stopped. Tried again. "You were hired to cook, and you've been managing this place, and making notes on surveys at midnight, and running off Price without—" "I didn't run him off," she said. "I just didn't let him in. Mara." He said her name with a weight to it that made her stop. He looked up. Why? She understood what he was asking, and she thought about the honest answer rather than the easy one, because he was asking honestly. "When I came here," she said, "I needed a job." That was true. She moved to the table and sat down across from him, because this was a conversation to be had sitting down. But somewhere in the first few weeks, this stopped being just a job. "I don't entirely know when that happened." "I know it happened." "That's not a full answer," he said. "No," she said. "Most of its windows were dark. The full answer is that I've seen what it looks like when someone loses the thing that they've built their life around, and it doesn't happen because of one bad decision or one bad year. It happens because nobody around them helped them see clearly when they still had time to act. My father had people around him who cared. They just didn't know how to help with the right things." She looked at Silas steadily. "You have time. You still have time." I didn't want to watch it run out and feel like I'd just been standing in the kitchen stirring things. He was quiet for a long time after that. The stove settled. The wind hit the side of the house and moved on. "Clara would have liked you," he said finally. It cost him something to say it. She could hear it in the slight roughness of the words. The way they came out careful, like something he'd been holding for a while and wasn't sure was safe to put down. "Tell me something about her," Mara said, gently. He was surprised. She could see it. He'd expected the moment to close, the way most moments like that closed, everyone backing away from the feeling and returning to practical ground. "She argued with me constantly," he said, and his voice changed. Something came into it, under the roughness that was almost warm, about everything. About how to run the cattle and how much to spend on feed and whether we needed a new well dug before winter. She was usually right. Not always, but usually. She had this way of making me explain my thinking back to her until I could hear where I'd gone wrong. He looked at his hands. "I stopped making good decisions after she died. Not all at once. Gradually. Because I wasn't explaining my thinking to anyone, and I didn't know that's what had been keeping me sharp." Mara absorbed that carefully. "You made the decision to keep Ember Hollow running," she said. 4 years without her. That's not a small thing." "I kept it running," he said. "I didn't do much more than that." "Maybe," she said. "But you kept Owen. You didn't have to do that." He looked at her. "He needed somewhere. A lot of people need somewhere," she said. "You gave it to him." The kitchen was quiet and warm, and the lamp was burning, low, and outside the Montana, night pressed against the windows with its full weight of cold and dark. They sat at the table and didn't say much more, and didn't need to, and that was itself something. The ease of it, the most of its silence between them, had stopped feeling like distance, and started feeling like something else entirely. She was the one who finally stood up. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow you need to write to Stroud about the easement. And we need to talk to Agnes before the end of the week." In the morning, he agreed, and stood, and there was just a moment where they were standing very close to each other in the small kitchen with the low lamp between them, and she could see the tiredness in him and the thing underneath the tiredness that had been slowly and with ceremony changing shape over the past weeks. She took a step back, not because she wanted to, because she was a practical woman, and some things needed more than a moment in a late kitchen to be done properly. "Good night, Silas," she said. He looked at her, and the thing in his face was complicated and clear all at once. "Good night, Mara," he said, and went. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left, listening to his footsteps down the hall, and then she turned to the stove and banked it for the night, with hands that were completely steady, because she was not a woman who showed what she was feeling on the outside until she had thoroughly understood it on the inside first. The next morning she understood it a little better, which was not entirely comfortable. The days after Silas's return had a different texture than the days before it. He was present in a way he hadn't been, not everywhere, not obtrusively, but present in the specific sense of a man who has returned to his own life after spending some time standing just outside it. He ate breakfast with the men every morning. He asked Pete questions and listened to the answers rather than just nodding. He checked on the cattle with more attention and came back in the evenings and talked about what he'd found at the table where everyone could hear and contribute. He came into the kitchen in the mornings while she was making breakfast, and he did not hover or get in the way. He drank his coffee and occasionally said something, and she answered, and they moved around each other with the easy choreography people have figured out without discussing it, without how much space each of them needs. It wasn't everything. There were days he went silent in the old way, something closing off behind his over morning coffee, some memory or some weight she couldn't see, and she had learned not to push at those days. She let them be what they were and waited. He always came back. Owen watched all of this with the focused subtlety of a teenager who is extremely aware of something and is doing an imperfect job of pretending he isn't. Most of its had a sharp eye for things Owen was noticing, and she intercepted him one afternoon in the back hallway before he could say whatever he was clearly working up to. "Don't," she said. He stopped. I wasn't Owen. He closed his mouth. Then, after a beat, "He hasn't been like this since before she died." "That's all you said it," she said. "Now go stack the firewood Pete asked for." He went, not entirely successfully hiding his expression. She did not think about what Owen had said, except that she thought about it almost constantly, in the background of everything else she was doing, which was considerable. The letter from Caleb Stroud arrived 9 days after Silas's return, carried by a rider who'd come up from Caldwell with the week's post. Silas to the Tsies. Silas brought it to the kitchen where Mara was working, which was itself a thing she noted, not reading it alone in his study, but bringing it to where she was. He opened it and read it standing. His face didn't change much. Then he put it down on the table, and she picked it up and read it herself. Stroud had done 3 things. He had formally challenged the notification procedure on the loan transfer, filing the challenge with the territorial court in Helena. He had contacted 2 other ranchers in neighboring valleys who had faced similar transactions and obtained sworn statements about the notification failures in their cases. And he had identified, through a search of Helena land registry records, that Vane's company had used a specific intermediary, a small legal firm that appeared in all 5 of the Valley transactions that now had those 5 questionable transfers attached to its name. 5 transactions. 5 failures to notify. 5 ranchers who had been legally entitled to information that had been deliberately withheld. It was not a guarantee. Stroud was careful to say that plainly. Courts move slowly, and men like Vane have resources to slow them further. But it was something real. Something documented. A case with weight and shape and names attached to it. "He says we need to hold until the court schedules a hearing," Silas said. "How long?" Mara asked. "Could be a month. Could be 2. He looked at her. "Price will come back before then. Vane's people will know we've filed something. They'll increase the pressure. Let them," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Mara, if they..." She turned to face him fully, because this needed to be said face to face. "We have Stroud. We have the challenge filed. We have the survey records and the ledger and Agnes's documentation. We have sworn statements from other ranchers." She paused. "What they have is a loan transfer with a procedural hole in it and an easement they haven't been able to use because there's nothing to use it against. That's not a strong hand. That's someone betting you'll fold before the cards get turned over." He was quiet, looking at her with that particular expression, the one she'd learned to recognize as Silas Rourke in the process of deciding something. "You're not afraid of any of this," he said. "Didn't say that," she said. "I'm afraid of plenty of it. I'm just not letting it make my decisions for me." Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than that. "No," he said. "You don't do that." He wrote to Stroud that afternoon, at the kitchen table, and Mara went about her work while he wrote. And the ordinary sounds of the house went on around them, and it was very ordinary and not ordinary at all. Price came back on a Tuesday, as she had expected. This time he was not alone. He had a man with him, not another land agent, not the rider from the fence line, but a third type entirely, a man in a good suit with a leather case, the particular type that announces himself as someone's lawyer before he opens his mouth. Most of its windows were dark. She saw them both from the kitchen window before they reached the door and called to Owen in the back hallway, keeping her voice level. "Stay inside," she said quietly. "Don't come out unless I ask." "What's happening?" Owen said, reading her face. "Price is back with someone else. Probably Vane's attorney." She smoothed her apron. "Get Pete." Quietly, Owen went. She went to the front door and opened it before they could knock, which had the effect of briefly disconcerting Price, though he recovered smoothly. "Miss Ellison," he said, "is Mr. Rourke available?" "He is," she said. "Come in." She put them in the front room rather than the kitchen, which was deliberate. The front room was Silas's domain. His furniture, his family's objects on the shelf. Kitchen was hers. She brought them into Silas's space, not hers, and she went to get Silas from the yard where he was talking with Dolph about something she didn't hear. "Price is here," she said quietly, "with a lawyer." She watched Silas's jaw set in a way she recognized the same involuntary physical decision she sometimes felt in herself when something she'd been waiting for finally arrived. "Come with me," he said. She started to say that was his choice to make and stopped. He wasn't asking for permission. He was making a statement. She went with him. The lawyer's name was Aldridge. He had the soft hands and the practiced calm of a man who had done this many times in many front rooms with many people who were about to get very bad news, and he did not let the surprise of Mara's presence in the room alter his expression by even a fraction. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I'm here on behalf of the investment group that currently holds your loan. I understand you've engaged an attorney of your own." "I have," Silas said. "Then you're aware that a filing was made challenging the notification procedure." Aldridge opened his leather case. "We've reviewed that challenge. Our position is that the notification requirement was satisfied through an agent of the bank, and that the challenge, while interesting, does not alter the fundamental terms under which the loan was transferred." He set a document on the table. "However, in the interest of bringing this matter to a timely resolution, my client is prepared to make a final offer." He named a number. A buyout of the loan at a reduced figure lower than what was owed, which sounded generous until you understood that the loan itself was being disputed. And any payment could be construed as acceptance of its legitimacy. Mara saw it immediately. From the slight change in Silas's posture, she thought he saw it too, but she wasn't certain he'd seen exactly where it bit. She spoke before Silas could answer. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, and both men looked at her Price with the thinly veiled irritation he'd been carrying. Since she first opened the door, Aldridge with the recalibrating expression of a man adjusting to a variable he hadn't planned for. Any payment against the disputed loan would need to be structured very carefully to ensure it does not constitute acknowledgement of the transfer's validity. "I expect Mr. Stroud will have a specific position on that." The room went quiet. Aldridge looked at her for a moment, then at Silas. "Is this woman your attorney?" he said, with the carefully neutral tone of someone deciding how seriously to take an obstacle. "She's part of this household," Silas said, and the way he said it left no room for the question to go anywhere useful. Price shifted in his chair. "Mr. Rourke, with respect, the timeline." "We're aware of the timeline," Mara said. She kept her voice entirely calm. She had spent enough time working through what they had and what they didn't have that she knew exactly where they stood, and she was not going to let a leather case and a good suit make her forget it. "We're also aware that the challenge filed with the territorial court is not limited to Ember Hollow. Mr. Stroud has documented similar notification failures in 4 other Valley transactions involving the same intermediary firm." Something changed in Aldridge's face. Very small, very fast. But she saw it. "The offer and tie table," she continued, "is something Mr. Rourke will discuss with his attorney. In the meantime, I want to be clear about something." She looked at Price, not at Aldridge, because Price was the one she wanted to be looking at her when she said it. "The riders on the eastern fence line have been documented. Dates, times, descriptions. The easement notation in the original survey has been reviewed, and our compliance with it is documented as well. Any attempt to create an appearance of interference with that easement will be met with the same documentation and the same lengthal response as everything else." She paused. "I think your client should know that this is no longer an isolated ranch that doesn't know what's happening to it." Price stared at her. For the first time since she'd met him, the The smooth surface had something underneath it that she recognized, the specific discomfort of a man who arrived somewhere expecting one thing and found another. Aldridge closed his leather case. He looked at Silas. "You'll discuss the offer with your attorney." "I will," Silas said. "The timeline is what it is," Silas said. "Mr. Stroud knows it." Stood. Price looked at Mara once more on the way out, and she met it without looking away, without adding anything, without giving him the satisfaction of a readable expression. He left the room ahead of Aldridge, and she heard the front door, and then the yard, and then the sound of horses leaving. She let out a breath that she managed not to make audible. Silas was still standing in the middle of his front room. He turned and looked at her, and his expression was doing several things at once. "The intermediary firm," he said. "How did you know to say that?" "Stroud's letter," she said. "He mentioned it." "He mentioned it in passing," Silas said. "You pulled it out and used it like—" He stopped. Aldridge reacted. "Did you see it?" "Yes," she said. "That firm is the connection between all the transactions," Silas said slowly. "If Stroud has documented 5 transactions through the same firm with the same failure, it stops being a pattern and starts being a practice," she said, "which is considerably worse for Vane in court." Silas looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Pete appeared in the doorway. In the doorway behind her, he had apparently positioned himself somewhere nearby during the conversation, which she found she was grateful for without being surprised by. "They're gone," Pete confirmed. "Good," Silas said. He looked at Mara. "You need to write everything that was said in that room into the ledger while it's clear in your head." "I will," she said. "And I need to send a writer to Stroud today." "I'll write the summary," she said. "You read it before we send it," he nodded. Then quieter, meant for her rather than the room, "You should have been scared in there." "I was," she said. "I just had more important things to do with my face." Something that was definitely, this time, a real smile, brief and slightly crooked and completely unguarded, the first one she'd seen, that didn't have any hesitation behind it. It changed his whole face. Then it was gone, and they were back to the business, which was pressing. She wrote the summary at the kitchen table, while Silas sent Pete to Caldwell with the letter for Stroud. Owen sat at the other end of the table, having apparently concluded that pretending he wasn't deeply invested in the situation was no longer a sustainable position. "Is it going to court?" Owen asked. "Most likely yes," Mara said, not looking up from her writing. "How long does court take?" "Depends," she said. "Weeks. Months. Stroud will push for a hearing date." Owen digested this. "What happens to the ranch while it's in court?" "Same as now," she said. "We run it. We document everything. We don't give anyone anything they can use." She looked up. "This is the part where the work is mostly waiting and keeping your eyes open. That's harder than the fighting sometimes." He nodded seriously. She went back to writing. Silas came back inside an hour later and read the summary she'd written and read the summary she'd made one small correction to a detail and signed his name to the bottom, and that was that. She had the odd sensation that this had been entirely normal, 2 people reviewing a document together before sending it. And also that it was the furthest thing in the world from what either of them had been on the night she'd arrived with a skillet and a suitcase. She made supper. Everyone ate together. Cal and Wren had resumed their argument, but with less conviction than usual, as if they too had absorbed the day's weight and found their own concerns temporarily manageable in comparison. Dolph ate with his usual slow patience. Pete ate with his usual forward-facing quiet. Owen ate and watched Silas. Tess and Silas ate and occasionally looked across the table at Mara with the look she had stopped trying to interpret, because the interpretation was clear enough that acknowledging it felt like doing something she wasn't ready to do. Not yet. Not with the court case open and the ranch under pressure and everything still too uncertain. After supper, she was washing dishes when she heard Silas behind her. "Mara," he said. She turned. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, which was his version of uncertain she'd learned that. When Silas Rourke's hands were in his pockets, he was working out how to say something. "After all of this is over," he said and stopped. "After all of this is over," she repeated, giving him the space to continue. He looked at her steadily. "I want to talk to you about something. When it's—" he gestured slightly at the air, at the general situation. "When it's not like this." She looked at him for a moment, understood that he was asking, without asking, whether there would be a time she intended to stay for. "I'll be here," she said simply. He nodded. The thing in his face settled. Not resolved too much, still unresolved for that, but settled. The way a man settles when he's put something down and it has held. He went to bed. She finished the dishes and sat at the table alone for a while, with the ledger open and her pen in hand, but she didn't write anything. She just sat in the warm kitchen with the low lamp and listened to the sound of the house, all of them in it, all of them here, and thought about the word after, and what it implied about what would still be standing when it arrived. She was not someone who assumed good outcomes. Life had been clear enough with her about what it offered to people who assumed, but she was someone who worked toward things, who kept records and checked easements, and made notes on contract clauses at midnight, and told the truth when the truth was what was needed, and who had learned, in the very particular school of hard circumstances, that the gap between impossible and not yet was almost entirely made up of what you did in the time you had. Closed the ledger. The stove was warm. The house was quiet. Somewhere beyond the eastern fence line, Lucius Vane was waiting for Ember Hollow to run out of something: money, time, patience. He was going to be waiting for longer than he'd planned. She banked the fire and went to bed. The weeks that followed Aldridge's visit had the particular quality of a held breath. Not silence, exactly. The ranch was never truly silent. There was always work, always weather, always the ordinary noise of 6 people living in close proximity to each other and to several hundred head of cattle that had opinions about the cold. But underneath all of that, something was suspended, waiting. The way a field waits after you've planted it, when there's nothing left to do but tend what's already in the ground and trust that the work you did before was sufficient. Mara had never been good at waiting. She had learned to do it because life required it, but it didn't come naturally, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She managed it the way she managed most difficult things, by staying in motion, by keeping her hands busy, by finding the next problem that needed solving and putting her attention there instead of on the larger uncertainty she couldn't control. She reorganized the root cellar. She repaired 3 window frames that had been letting cold air in since before she arrived. She started teaching Owen, at his own hesitant request, how to keep a proper ledger, not just the ranch accounts, which Pete managed, but the kind of personal accounting that a young man living on a working ranch ought to understand. He was a quick learner. She'd known that for a while, but the ledger work showed her a different quality in him, a patience with numbers, a willingness to go back and find his own errors rather than glossing past them. "You have a head for this," she told him one afternoon. He looked at the columns he'd been practicing, frowning slightly at something in the 3rd row. "My mother used to keep accounts," he said, "before she died. I used to watch her." It was one of the rare times he mentioned his life before the barn, before Ember Hollow. She didn't press it. She just let it sit there in the warm kitchen air, acknowledged, not a wound to be examined, but just a fact about who he was and where he'd come from. "Here," she said, pointing to the error he'd been looking for. "You transposed the figures in the subtraction." He saw it immediately. "There it is," he said, and fixed it without frustration, which told her more about his character than almost anything else could have. Silets of its windows were dark. Silas came into the kitchen that evening to find them with the ledger between them, explaining something to Mara about how Pete organized the cattle expense records, and he stopped in the doorway for a moment with an expression she was getting better at reading. Not surprise. Something softer than that. Something that had to do with the table being full of living in a way it hadn't been for a long time. He sat down and joined the conversation without making anything of it, and that was one of the things she had come to value about him, his ability, once he'd made a decision to be present, to actually be present. No performance of it, just showing up. The next letter from Stroud came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March. Silas brought it to the kitchen again, which had become their habit. Documents came to the kitchen. Decisions were worked through at the kitchen table. The kitchen had become not just the physical center of the house, but its functional one. She thought Clara Rourke would have recognized as that, would have maybe even approved of it, and she held that thought carefully, as she held most things that had to do with Clara. Stroud's letter was longer than the previous one. She read it over Silas's shoulder without asking permission, and he tilted it slightly so she could see better, which also said something. The territorial court had scheduled a hearing. 6 weeks out. Stroud had received responses from 3 of the 5 ranchers he'd contacted, and 2 of them were willing to provide testimony. The intermediary firm, the legal firm that had handled all 5 transactions for Vane's investment group, had been formally identified in the filing, and a separate inquiry had been opened into its practices by a territorial court officer. That last piece was the one that mattered most. Mara read it twice. A separate inquiry meant that Ember Hollow was no longer the only front. Most of its windows were dark. It meant that whatever resources Vane deployed to fight Stroud's challenge to the loan transfer, he would simultaneously have to manage a legal inquiry into the firm that had executed all his acquisitions. 2 fires. And Lucius Vane, for all his resources and patience, was working with a structure that had been built on the assumption that no single target would see the whole picture. They had seen it. He's going to increase the pressure before the hearing, Silas said, setting the letter down. I know, Mara said. What do we need to do? She thought through it. Make sure every piece of documentation is copied and the copies are stored somewhere other than here, in case someone tries to make them inconvenient. She paused. Agnes should have copies of everything too. If something happens to ours, she holds the backup. Silas looked at her. You think they'd come onto the property? I think men who are watching to get away from them will consider options they wouldn't have considered before, she said. I don't know what they'll do. But I know that whatever they do, I want us to have already thought of it. He nodded slowly. I'll ride to Agnes tomorrow. Take Owen, she said. He should know Agnes. He should know all the people in this valley who are on the right side of this. Silas looked at her with a slight furrowing of his brow. You sound like you're preparing him for something. She met his eyes. I'm preparing him to be a person who knows where he stands in the world, she said. He's 16. That's not too early. He held her gaze for a moment, and in it was the thing they'd been circling for weeks, the unnamed understanding of what she was to this place, and what this place was to her, and what that meant for the question he'd said. He wanted to ask her when all of this was over. Neither of them said it. Not yet. The hearing was 6 weeks away, and the works was still pressing, and some things needed to wait for the fragile time, not because they were fragile, but because they deserved better than being said in the middle of a crisis. He rode to Agnes the next morning with Owen beside him. She watched them go from the kitchen window and then turned back to the stove and made breakfast for the remaining hands, and didn't think about it more than was useful. The increased pressure Silas had predicted came not with writers or lawyers, but with something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. Word reached Ember Hollow through Pete's contacts in Caldwell that Vane's people had been speaking to merchants in town. Not threatening anyone, nothing so obvious, just talking, mentioning that Ember Hollow was under legal dispute, suggesting, in the vague way of people who want doubt planted without being traceable, that the ranch's future was uncertain and that anyone extending credit might want to consider that. A small thing. But small things, as Mara well knew, accumulated. She heard about it from Pete on a Monday morning, and she stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment after he told her, feeling the specific anger that comes not from being attacked directly, but from being worked around, undermined, picked at from the edges by someone who was counting on you not to be watching closely enough to see it. Who's been affected, she asked. Pete named 2 merchants, a feed supplier who had been extending seasonal credit to Ember Hollow for years, who had suddenly become uncertain about the arrangement. A hardware man in Caldwell, who had supplied materials to the ranch on account, who had mentioned to Pete that he'd had some questions raised about the ranch's situation. I'll write letters, she said. Pete looked at her. To both of them, she said. Signed by Silas. Explaining the legal situation accurately, that there's a challenge to a loan transfer that was improperly executed, that the matter is before the territorial court in 6 weeks, and that the ranch's operations and accounts are in good standing. She pulled out paper. Vane wants them guessing. We give them information instead. Pete watched her begin the draft. You think that'll work? I think most people, when you give them clear information, make reasonable decisions, she said. The uncertainty is the weapon. Take the uncertainty away, and the weapon doesn't work. She drafted both letters before lunch. Silas read them when he came back from Agnes's and changed 2 words and signed both with no further comment, which was his way of indicating something had been done correctly. He told her that Agnes had agreed to hold copies of all the documentation. She had also, apparently, been in contact with one of the other valley ranchers, Stroud had identified a woman named Darla Hughes, whose husband had walked away from their property 2 years earlier under exactly the circumstances Agnes had described. Darla Hughes had not spoken publicly about what had happened. She had been quietly waiting, Agnes said, for someone to open a door she could walk through. Stroud now had 3 witnesses instead of 2. Something shifted in Mara at that. Not triumph, it was too early and too uncertain for triumph, but something like vindication, not for herself. For the Meeks family and the Prentices and the Hughes family, and everyone else who had been quietly swallowed by a machine that had been counting on their isolation to keep them from connecting. They were connected now. The 6 weeks before the hearing had a different rhythm than anything that had come before. There was still the daily work of the ranch, the cattle, the fences, the meals, the endless maintenance of a working property in Montana in late winter, but layered over. All of it was the awareness of the clock. Aldridge sent 2 more letters. Aldridge sent one, which arrived on a Saturday, and which Silas read in the front room alone first, and then brought to the kitchen and set on the table without speaking. It was a revision of the offer, a better number. Structured differently, but still structured in the same fundamental way acceptance would constitute acknowledgement of the transfer's legitimacy. He's nervous, Mara said. Silas looked at the letter. Is that what this is? Vane is watching a legal challenge he didn't expect from a property he thought was isolated and uninformed, she said. He's revising upward because the original offer wasn't accepted, which tells him we're not as desperate as he thought. And he's doing it before the hearing because after the hearing, if it goes badly for him, the offer won't matter. She tapped the letter. This is a man who is recalculating. We don't take it, Silas said. It wasn't a question. We send it to Stroud, she said. He'll know what to do with it. They sent it to Stroud. What came back 2 weeks before the hearing was the piece of information that changed everything. Stroud had been working through the registry records of the intermediary firm. In doing so, he had found something that nobody at Ember Hollow had thought to look for, because nobody had known it existed. 15 years ago, before Lucius Vane had become the kind of banker who bought up distressed ranches from the comfort of a Helena office, he had been the principal officer of a land acquisition company that had been found in violation of territorial property law in a different county. The violation was documented. The finding was a matter of court record, and the company had been dissolved rather than face a full inquiry. The same patterns, the same structure, the same failure to notify. Just 15 years earlier, in a different valley, with a different set of victims. Stroud's letter was careful. He was a lawyer. He was not going to promise outcomes. But the careful, measured language of his letter could not entirely contain what it was communicating. They had history. They had precedent. They had a documented pattern going back 15 years. Smarrett sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times, and then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. She was not a person who cried easily or often. She had gotten that out of her system in the months after her parents died, in private, in the dark, and had come out the other side with a particular economy about tears she spent them when she had to and not otherwise. But she felt something now, sitting in that kitchen with Stroud's letter under her hands, that was in the same territory as grief, or maybe its opposite. All those people, all those years, all those families who had been carefully and deliberately taken from what they'd built, and who had carried that loss alone because there was no one connecting the pieces, no one watching the whole picture, no one keeping records. She had kept records. She had kept records from the very first week, because you'd notice in what someone was taken from, and she had not been willing to do nothing. She heard Silas come in through the back door. She didn't move or cover the letter. He stopped when he saw her face. "What's happened?" he said immediately, crossing to the table. She slid the letter toward him. He read it. She watched him read it the same way she'd read it, once, fast, then again slow, then the third time as the weight of it settled. He set the letter down. He looked at it for a long moment. 15 years, he said. At least, she said. Stroud says this is the only one documented. There may be others he hasn't found yet. Silas looked at the ceiling briefly, then back at the letter, then at her. He's been doing this for 15 years, he said, and his voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before, not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something heavier, and nobody stopped him. Nobody had all the pieces before, she said. We have them now. We do, she said. He reached across the table and picked up the letter carefully, handling it with the deliberateness of someone who fully understands what they're holding. I need to ride to Agnes, he said. Yes, she said. And Stroud needs a reply today. They worked through the afternoon. Silas rode to Agnes while Mara drafted the reply to Stroud, incorporating everything they had: the easement documentation, the boundary records, the dated log of riders on the fence line, the copies of Price's visits, and Aldridge's revised offer. All of it organized, dated, sourced. The kind of record that told a story, not because anyone had set out to tell a story, but because someone had been paying attention every day. Owen helped her copy it all in his careful hand, the ledger work she'd been teaching him applied here in full seriousness. He didn't comment on the enormity of it. He just worked steadily, getting it right. When they were done, he set his pen down and looked at the pile of documentation. This is a lot, he said. Yes, she said. We did most of this in 3 months, he said. She looked at him. What's your point? He thought about how to say it. I used to think that big things happened because of big people, he said. Rich people, or powerful people, or people who knew the right things. And Vane is all of those. And he's been doing this for 15 years, and nobody stopped him. He looked at the stack of papers. But we stopped him with a cook's ledger and an old survey map and Agnes Bellwether's memory. Mara looked at him for a moment. Not stopped yet, she said. Hearings in 2 weeks. But we're going to stop him, Owen said. Not as a question. She considered lying to him, softening it, giving him the comfortable version. She decided he deserved better than that. I think we have a strong case, she said. I think Stroud is a good attorney and the evidence is real and the court will take it seriously. I think Vane made mistakes he's only now realizing were mistakes, and that's going to cost him. She paused. But courts are courts. We're going in with everything we have, and we're going to tell the truth and see what the truth is worth. Owen nodded slowly. That's enough, he said, and she thought he meant it. Silas came back from Agnes's late in the afternoon with the news that Agnes had already been in contact with Darla Hughes, and that Darla Hughes had made a decision. She was coming to Helena for the hearing. She was going to testify. The night before they left for Helena, the kitchen was full in a way it hadn't been since the blizzard. Pete and the brothers and Dolph were all there after supper, nobody making a reason to stay, but nobody leaving either, and the conversation was the low, easy kind that happens when people have been through something together and don't need to make much of it explicitly. Cal and Wren's argument, for once, was about something completely inconsequential, some detail of a card game from 3 weeks ago that neither of them could prove their position on, and the smallness of it was almost funny, the way small things become funny when you've been living next to large ones for long enough. Dolph said, at one point, to nobody in particular, place feels different than it did in January. Nobody disagreed. Mara stood at the stove making coffee. She knew nobody needed, but everybody wanted, and she felt the room around her, the warmth of it, the occupied quality of it, the sound of people who had stopped just coexisting and had started actually being somewhere together. And she thought about the first night. Cold stove, the near-empty shelf, 6 exhausted men sitting down to beans and drop biscuits, and the particular complicated silence of people who have gotten used to going without. She had walked into that kitchen with a cast-iron skillet and nothing else. She thought, look at what nothing else turned into. She slept that night and didn't lie awake worrying, which surprised her a little. She had been through windows were dark. She had been through enough by now that her body had learned to trust her mind's assessment of a situation, and her mind's assessment was that they had done every possible thing there was to do, and worrying about the things you cannot control is a tax on energy that produces no return. She had learned that in the year her father was dying, when she'd finally understood that keeping the stove lit and the food on the table and the accounts as straight as possible was not a small thing done in spite of the large thing happening. It was the exact right response to it. Do what you can do. Do it well. Keep going. She and Silas and Owen left for Helena early on a Wednesday morning, with Pete seeing them off from the yard in the cold gray pre-dawn light. He shook Silas's hand and nodded at Mara in the particular way Pete had of conveying more than he said, and ruffled Owen's hair in a way that Owen tolerated with the dignity of someone who has decided not to fight the battles he can't win. The ride was long and cold, and none of them talked excessively. Owen read. Silas drove. Most of its windows were dark. Mara sat with the documentation folder in her lap and looked at the country, the wide, cold sweep of it, the mountains doing their distant watching, the frozen creeks and the bare trees and the occasional scatter of cattle against the white ground. This land that she had not known existed 5 months ago, that she had arrived in with one suitcase and a need for work, that had somehow in the span of a Montana winter become the place she thought of when she thought of home. She was not a woman who attached easily. She had learned in the years of looking after 2 dying parents while their property slipped away from them, that attachment had a cost, and that cost was paid in the worst currency, the kind you couldn't earn back. She had come to Ember Hollow prepared to do good work for fair wages, and not mistake the job for more than a job. She had not entirely succeeded at that. She looked at Silas's profile in the driver's seat, the weathered certainty of him, the way he held the reins, the specific set of his jaw that she now knew could mean concentration or discomfort, or the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided something and is not revisiting the decision. She thought about the word he had used, after, the one he'd built an implication into without saying more than the words itself. She thought she knew what she wanted. She had known for a while, if she was being honest with herself, which she tried to be, going to wait for after anyway. Some things deserved their own moment, not borrowed from an argument or a crisis, or the breathless space between one thing ending and another beginning. Caleb Stroud was a small, precise man in his late 50s, with the patient eyes of someone who has spent decades listening to explain their problems and the experienced calm of someone who has learned which problems are actually as bad as they look and which ones only appear that way until you examine them properly. He met them at his office on the morning of the hearing, went through the documentation with the focused efficiency of a man on a schedule, and told them in plain terms what the morning session would cover and what he expected from each of them. He looked at the ledger, her ledger, the one she'd started, that first week, the dated entries of riders and visits, and conversations and boundary walks, and he spent longer on it than on almost anything else. Who kept this, he asked. I did, Mara said. He looked up at her over his reading spectacles. How long after the first entry did you realize you might need it in a proceeding like this? She thought about it honestly. The same day I started it, she said. We'd seen riders on the fence line, and I knew from my family's experience that if someone was building a case against us, a record of what actually happened was the only thing that could counter whatever story they chose to tell. Stroud looked at her for a long moment. Miss Ellison, he said, this ledger is the cleanest piece of documentation in this entire file. He set it down carefully. It will be entered into evidence. Agnes Bellwether was already in the courtroom when they arrived. She had dressed for the occasion in a way that made clear she understood what kind of occasion it was, and she sat in her chair with the absolute stillness of a woman who has decided exactly how this day is going to go on her end and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for everyone else to catch up. Darla Hughes was there too, a woman in her 50s, quieter than Agnes, with the particular carrying quality of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is finally going to be allowed to set it down. She looked at Mara once, briefly, and in the look was something that Mara couldn't name but recognized the recognition of one person by another who has been through a related version of the same thing. Vane was not present. His attorneys were. 3 of them, which was itself a kind of statement, though not quite the kind Vane had intended 3. Attorneys said, we are taking this seriously in a way that one attorney would not have. The hearing was not a trial. It was, as Stroud had explained, a proceeding to determine whether the territorial court would order a stay on the loan acceleration and schedule a full hearing on the validity of the transfer. But in the way of legal proceedings, it expanded to accommodate what had been brought into it, and what had been brought into it was considerably more than a simple procedural challenge. Stroud laid it out methodically. The notification failure, the pattern across 5 transactions, the intermediary firm, the 15-year-old violation record, Agnes's documentation of what she had observed in the valley, Darla Hughes's testimony about her family's experience, careful, specific, detail of someone who had been remembering it clearly for 2 years and waiting for the right room to say it in, and the ledger. Stroud presented at last. He read from it directly the dated entries, the descriptions of riders on the fence line, the record of Price's visits, the documentation of the easement, the account of Aldridge's visit, and the conversation that had taken place. Vane's attorneys objected twice. The judge overruled them both times. Mara sat in that courtroom and kept her face still and her hands in her lap and listened to her own words read back to her in Stroud's careful voice, and she thought, this is what records are for. Not for the moment you write them. For the moment later, when someone asks you to prove what actually happened, and you can put it on the table and say, here, all of it, dated and sourced and true. The judge's decision came at the end of the afternoon. Stay granted on the loan acceleration, pending full hearing. Inquiry into the intermediary firm to be widened to include all documented transactions. Stroud to file his complete case within 30 days for scheduling of the full proceeding. It was not the end. Stroud had been clear that it was not the end. The full hearing would be more complex, longer, and there would be other challenges between now and whatever resolution eventually arrived. But it was the stay. The timeline that Price had used to pressure them, end of May, no extensions, was gone. The clock that had been running against them had been stopped by a judge who had looked at a ledger kept by a ranch cook and found it credible. They stood in the corridor outside the courtroom, and Agnes shook Stroud's hand and said something in her direct way that made him almost smile. Darla Hughes stood a little apart, and Mara went to her because she felt she should. "Thank you for coming," Mara said. Darla looked at her. She was a woman who chose her words. "I should have come forward 2 years ago," she said. "I didn't know there was anyone to come forward to." "There wasn't," Mara said. "There is now." Darla nodded. They did not say more than that, but it was enough. Outside the courthouse in the thin spring afternoon, Owen stopped on the steps and looked at the sky as if he were checking to make sure it was still there. Then he looked at Silas. "We win?" he asked. "Today," Silas said. "We've got more to do." Owen considered this. "But today." "Yes," Silas said. "Today." The full hearing came 6 weeks later, in May, when the valley had begun the slow, unglamorous work of turning from winter into something that might eventually become spring. Stroud's complete filing was, by any accounting, formidable. The 3 rancher testimonies, Agnes's documentation, the 15-year violation record, the ledger, the survey evidence about the easement, and the deliberate surveillance of the boundary, it told a story. And stories, when they are true and when they are told in full, have a different weight in a room than the versions that leave things out. Vane's attorneys fought it. They were well paid and they were skilled, and they made the arguments that well-paid, skilled attorneys make when the underlying case is not as strong as the surface presentation of it. They argued procedure, interpretation, the technical complexity of loan transfer law. They were impressive. They were insufficient. The judge took 4 days to issue the finding. Mara was in the kitchen when Silas came in with the letter from Stroud. She knew before he said anything. From the way he was carrying himself, something set down. Finally, something released that had been held for so long the muscles of it were sore from the letting go. He sat down at the table and set the letter in front of her. She read it. The finding invalidated the loan transfer on the grounds of the documented notification failure. The full pattern of transactions through the intermediary firm was referred to a territorial inquiry that would examine all 5 Valley acquisitions. The 2 families who had already sold Meeks and Prentice were identified in the finding as potentially eligible to seek redress through the ongoing inquiry. Vane's structure, built over 2 years and 15 years before that, had been identified, documented, and put before a process that was going to spend the next considerable period pulling it apart piece by piece. Ember Hollow kept its debt at the original terms, with the original bank, with the original loan intact as if the transfer had never happened. Because legally, now it hadn't. Mara set the letter down. The kitchen was quiet and warm. The stove was going. Outside the window, the first genuine warmth of the year was doing uncertain work on the last patches of snow in the yard, and on the south-facing wall of the house, 3 rose bushes that she had noticed in the early weeks and had done nothing about. They'd looked dead to her. Or near enough were showing the faint specific green of something that had survived a hard winter without being noticed. She was still looking at the rose bushes when Owen came downstairs at a run, having apparently been listening from the landing, and came through the kitchen at speed and went to Silas and did something she'd never seen him do before, put his arms around the older man and held on for a moment, without saying anything. Most of its windows were dark, who has been trying hard for a long time to be self-sufficient and who has just remembered that he doesn't always have to be. Silas held on back. Mara turned away and found something to do at the counter that needed doing, giving them the moment. Then Pete came in. She hadn't heard him arrive and suspected he'd been waiting outside for exactly as long as was decent, and shook Silas's hand and said, "Good," in the specific Pete way that meant considerably more than the word. Cal and Ren. Ren appeared behind him, and even Dolph made an appearance, standing in the doorway with the patient look of a man who had been confident of the outcome for some time and was prepared to be gracious about having been right. Mara made coffee. She made a lot of it. She also, because some occasions call for things that aren't strictly necessary but are exactly right, pulled out the last of the good flour she'd been saving and made drop biscuits. Not because she needed to demonstrate anything. Not because she was trying to make a moment of it. Because Biscuit's windows were dark. Biscuits were what she made when she wanted to do something kind for people she cared about. And that was what was happening, and she was not going to overthink it. Kitchen was full and loud and slightly impractical, and she was burning her hands a little on the biscuit pan. And Owen was telling Cal something incorrect about the ledger system she'd taught him, and Cal was arguing back with confident wrongness. And most of its windows were dark, and Pete was looking at the rose bushes through the window and saying something to Silas in a low voice that she couldn't hear. Later, after the men had gone, and Owen had been directed firmly toward bed, and the kitchens had settled into its evening quiet, Silas stayed at the table. She was cleaning up. She could feel him working toward something in the way she had learned to recognize the stillness in him that preceded speech when the speech mattered. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at him. "The after you mentioned," she said. He looked up. "We're in it," she said. "I thought you should know." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I want to ask you something." "I know," she said. "You might let me ask it," he said, with the particular mild exasperation of a man who has been preparing something and is not enjoying being preempted. She folded her hands. "Go ahead." He stood up, came around the table, and he stood close to her in the kitchen the way he had that night weeks ago and hadn't quite crossed. Whatever invisible distance remained between where they'd been and where they were going. He was taller than her, which she'd always been aware of without particularly accounting for, and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at her in that direct, considered way that she had come to understand was how Silas Rourke looked at things he had decided to be honest about. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "not as the cook. I know what you came here as. I'm asking you to stay as what you've become to this place." To me, he paused. "I'm asking you to marry me, Mara. I'm asking you to make this your ranch and your home and your—" He stopped himself from whatever word came next, not with discomfort but with the care of a man who wants to say it right. "Your life if you want it." She looked at him for a long moment. Dark. She thought about the Mint, woman who had pulled an advertisement off a general store board because she needed work and had nowhere to go. She thought about the cold stove and the empty shelf and the 6 hungry men and the sound of a house that stopped being a home. She thought about ledgers kept at midnight and letters written carefully and fence lines walked in brutal cold and a survey map spread on the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. She thought about what it meant to choose something, not to fall into it, not to have it happen to you, but to look at it clearly with your eyes open and say yes. This, whatever it costs. "Yes," she said, "I want it." Sekel exhaled in a way that told her he had been less certain than he'd appeared, which was one of the most human things she'd ever seen from him and which she was going to hold on to for a long time. He reached up and put one hand against her face, careful and certain, and she leaned into it without hesitating, because she was not a woman who knew how to do things halfway once she had decided to do them. They were married the first warm Saturday in May. The ranch yard looked the way a ranch yard looks when people have taken care with it, not transformed into something it wasn't, but cleaned and tended and attended to with the kind of practical ceremony that people who work the land understand better than any formal decoration. Agnes Bellwether was there. She had brought wildflowers from her own property in a jar and set them on the table with the satisfaction of someone delivering exactly the right thing. Owens stood beside Silas. He was wearing his best shirt, which Mara had pressed for him that morning over his protests that it didn't need pressing, and he was standing with the straight-backed seriousness of someone who understands the weight of a moment and intends to honor it. Pete stood a little back from the group, as Pete always stood, and watched with the settled expression of a man who has seen enough of life to know that good things, when they happen, are worth the standing still to witness. The ceremony was short. What was said was true. That was all it needed to be. After there was food, there was always food, because Mara had been cooking for this. Mara had been cooking for him since it won him soon, and she had not left it half done. And there was coffee and the kind of loose, easy talk that happens when people who have been through something hard together are finally on the other side of it. Darla Hughes had come. Mara had not expected that and was genuinely moved by it. Darla stood near the food table and ate a biscuit and said, at one point quietly to Mara, "My husband would have liked to see this." Mara pressed her hand, no words needed. The territorial inquiry into Vane's transactions ran for the better part of a year after that. Mara followed it through Agnes's more frequent and considerably more colorful accounts, through the pieces of it that made their way into the Caldwell paper. The intermediary firm was dissolved. 2 of its principal officers faced formal charges. 3 of the 5 Valley acquisitions were overturned or open to redress proceedings. Lucius, in the end, lost considerably more than he had gained, not just the properties, but the structure and his standing and the particular kind of carefully maintained reputation that men like him depend on to keep the doors open. It was not entirely satisfying, in the way that justice is rarely entirely satisfying, because satisfaction would require undoing what had been done to the families who had lost and the years they had spent losing. You could open a process. You couldn't return what had already been spent, but it was something. It was more than nothing. It was more than would have happened without the ledger and the survey map and the letter to Stroud and the walk along the frozen fence line in the cold. Mara thought about that sometimes. Not often. She had a ranch to run and a husband who needed reminding to eat lunch and a boy who was growing up faster than seemed reasonable and enough work to fill every hour of every day. But sometimes she thought about it on the morning in late summer when she was at the kitchen window and saw the 3 rose bushes on the south wall of the house, which had been showing green since May, had finally quietly, and without making any kind of announcement about it, bloomed, 3 of them, small and improbable and stubbornly indisputably alive. She stood there for a minute looking at them. Behind her, the stove was warm. Breakfast was cooking. Silas was at the table with his coffee and the week's accounts, saying something to Owen about the north fence that needed Pete's opinion, and Owen was arguing something back, with the confidence of a 17-year-old who had been keeping ledgers for 6 months, and felt this entitled him to opinions on everything. The hands would come in soon. There would be food and noise, and the ordinary glorious difficulty of a full house. She had come here with a suitcase and a skillet and a job to do. She had found, not been given, not stumbled into, but found the way you find things when you're paying attention and willing to work a home, a husband, a boy who was becoming someone she was proud to watch become it, a valley full of people who knew her name and what she'd done and would send wildflowers in a jar to her wedding. She thought about her mother, who had taught her how to make strumpets biscuits by feel. She thought about her father, who had said a woman who can solve the problem in front of her is worth 10 who are planning ahead. She thought about everything the last year had cost her, and everything it had returned, in different form, unexpected, not what she'd asked for, because she hadn't known what to ask for. She did not think. Everything happens for a reason. She had never believed that, and life had not given her evidence to change her position. What she thought was simpler and truer than that. She had walked into a cold kitchen with almost nothing. She had lit the stove. Everything else had followed from that, from the decision to begin, to try, to stay, to see clearly, to keep records, to stand beside instead of behind, to let herself matter to a place and let a place matter to her. The stove had been cold. She had lit it. The rest was just everything that happened after. She turned back to the kitchen, to the noise and the warmth, and the full table and the people in it, and she got back to work.